Start with a soft, almost hushed tone, as if sharing a secret. The year is 1763. Close your eyes and imagine it with me. The American colonies, a string of pearls along the vast Atlantic coast. By day, it's a land of bustling harbors, of merchant shouts and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, a place where forests are being tamed into farms, and new towns are rising from the wilderness, each one a testament to hard work and boundless hope. But now, night has fallen. A gentle quiet settles over the cobbled streets of Boston, the sprawling plantations of Virginia, and the tidy brick homes of Philadelphia. Through the wavy glass of a window pane, we say a soft flickering glow. It's the light of a single candle, pushing back the immense darkness of a continent. A merchant, his brow furrowed in concentration, meticulously counts the day's earnings, a pile of coins, a mix of British pounds, Spanish dollars, and local script. This is the sound of commerce, the rhythm of colonial life. A family gathers around a hearth, the fire crackling, a mother humming a lullaby to a child bundled in her arms. Outside, the town crier makes his rounds, his voice a lonely echo in the cool night air. 10 o'clock, and all is well. On the surface, all asterisk is asterisk well. The colonists see themselves as loyal subjects of the British Crown, proud inheritors of English liberty and law. They toast to King George III. They fly the Union Jack, and they celebrate British victories as their own. Whose recently, they fought alongside British redcoats in the brutal French and Indian War, a conflict that raged across this very landscape. They bled for the empire, believing they were securing their homes, their futures, and their rightful place within it. The war was won, the French threat vanquished. A sense of optimism, of a new era of peace and prosperity, hangs in the air, as tangible as the scent of wood smoke and sea salt. But peace, as it turns out, comes at a cost. A very, very high cost. The war has left Britain with a mountain of debt, a staggering sum that threatens to cripple the empire. And as officials in London stare at the ledgers, their eyes drift across the Atlantic, landing squarely on their American colonies. The colonies, they reason, were the primary beneficiaries of the war. The soldiers fought and died to protect asterisk. Therefore, it is only fair that asterisk, they asterisk help pay for it. It seems logical, doesn't it? A simple matter of accounting. And so, it begins. Not with the thunder of cannons, but with the quiet scratching of a quill pen on parchment, thousands of miles away. A series of new laws, new acts, new taxes, start to flow from Parliament. First comes the Sugar Act in 1764, tightening customs enforcement and placing duties on foreign molasses and other goods. It's an annoyance, a disruption to the familiar patterns of trade. Merchants grumble, smugglers get a bit more creative. But for the average person, life goes on. It's a distant rumble of thunder, not yet a storm. Then, a year later, in 1765, comes something different. Something that feels personal. The Stamp Act. This isn't just a tax on imported luxuries for the wealthy. This is a tax on paper, on nearly asterisk, every asterisk, piece of paper a colonist might use. Newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, pamphlets, even diplomas. To be legal, each one must bear an official stamp. A stamp that must be paid for in British currency, no less, which is scarce in the colonies. Now, the rumble is getting closer. This isn't a tax on trade happening at a faraway port. This is a tax on daily life. It's a printer in Boston staring at his press, wondering how he can afford to print his newspaper. It's a young couple in Charleston, realizing their marriage license will cost them more. It's a lawyer in New York, explaining to his client that every document for their court case now carries an extra fee. It's a group of sailors in a tavern, slapping down their cards for a game, and realizing even this small escape comes with a price tag from the crown. The colonists had always paid taxes, of course. They paid local taxes, levied by their own elected assemblies, the Virginia House of Burgesses, the Massachusetts Assembly. They paid men they knew, men they had voted for, men who understood their local needs and answered to them. This was different. This tax was being imposed by Parliament, An institution where not a single colonist sat, where they had no representative to speak for them, to argue their case, to defend their interests. And in that realization, a profound and dangerous question begins to form. It's whispered in taverns over mugs of ale, debated in pamphlets hot off the press, and argued in the halls of colonial assemblies. It's a question that cuts to the very heart of their identity as Englishmen, to the core principles of liberty they held so dear. What happens when a people pay taxes but have no voice? What is the difference between taxation and theft? If there is no consent from the governed, this isn't about the money anymore. It's about the principle. The colonists see it as a line being crossed. A fundamental right, the right to be taxed only by one's own representatives, is being trampled. They see a future where this power, once established, could be used again and again, bleeding them dry, stripping them of their property and their freedom, all without their say. A dark thought begins to take root. They are not being treated as subjects with rights, but as a resource to be exploited. Suddenly, the nighttime quiet doesn't feel so peaceful. It feels tense, charged. The candlelight in the window is no longer just for counting coins or reading a book. It's now illuminating radical pamphlets, letters of protest being drafted, plans for boycotts being made. The whispers are growing louder. In the streets of Boston, a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty begins to organize. In Virginia, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry stands before the House of Burgesses and delivers a fiery speech that borders on treason, declaring that Virginians can only be taxed by their own assembly. His words spread like wildfire through the colonies. The idea of no taxation without representation becomes a rallying cry, a simple, powerful slogan that everyone can understand. It's a spark landing in a forest that has become dangerously dry. Effigies of stamp collectors are hung and burned in public squares. Mobs, once a rare occurrence, now gather with alarming frequency, intimidating officials and forcing them to resign. The stamps themselves, when they arrive from Britain, are seized and destroyed. The unified, explosive opposition catches London completely by surprise. They expected grumbling, not a full-blown insurrection against the king's authority. Think about that merchant we saw, counting his coins. A year ago, he was a loyal subject, focused on his business. Now, he's meeting in secret with other merchants, agreeing to stop importing British goods until the act is repealed. Think about that, mother, humming a lullaby. Now, she's joining other women, pledging to make her own homespun cloth rather than buy imported British textiles. The rebellion isn't just in the hands of politicians and radicals. It's becoming a part of the household, a choice made at the market and the spinning wheel. This is the moment of conception for the American Revolution. Not the battles, not the declarations, but the shift in the mind. The moment when being a loyal Englishman started to feel incompatible with being a free man. The Stamp Act crisis reveals a crack in the foundation of the British Empire, a deep and fundamental disagreement about power, rights, and identity. London eventually backs down, faced with economic chaos from the colonial boycotts and the sheer unworkability of enforcing the law. Parliament repeals the Stamp Act in 1766. Cheers erupt. In the colonies, bells ring, bonfires are lit, and toasts are made once again to the king. It seems the crisis has been averted, the bond between Britain and its colonies restored. But has it? On the very same day they repeal the Stamp Act, Parliament passes another law, the Declaratory Act. It's a short, simple statement, and most colonists, in their relief and celebration, barely notice it. But its message is chilling. It declares that Parliament's authority over the colonies is absolute, and that they have the right to pass laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The whisper of rebellion may have quieted for a moment, but the reason for it has just been carved into law. The core question remains unanswered, hanging in the air like a storm cloud that refuses to break. London has asserted its power, and the colonists have discovered theirs. The stage is now set. The trust has been broken, and everyone, on both sides of the Atlantic, is left wondering what will happen the next time Parliament decides to test its authority, because they know, with a certainty that chills them to the bone, that their asterisk will asterisk be next time. The quiet of the colonies has been shattered, and the echo will soon grow into a roar. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss Chapter 2. See you next time. The year is 1763. The world has been reshaped by the fire and fury of the 7 Years' War. From the icy plains of Canada to the sun-scorched fields of India, the conflict raged, a true world war before the term even existed. And from the smoke, one victor emerged, more powerful than any before it. Great Britain. The Treaty of Paris wasn't just a document. It was the birth certificate of a global empire. France, its age-old rival, was humbled, ceding vast territories in North America and beyond. Spain, too, felt the sting of defeat. The Royal Navy commanded the seas, its sails like a vast, white forest spanning every ocean. British merchants followed the flag, their ships laden with goods, creating a web of commerce that encircled the globe. London was the new Rome, the undisputed center of the world, buzzing with newfound power and immense wealth. The British Empire, on which the sun would supposedly never set, had dawned. Its future seemed limitless, its dominance absolute. But this grand victory came at a staggering cost. The war had been ruinously expensive. The national debt had ballooned, nearly doubling to an astronomical £133 million. To put that in perspective, the entire annual budget of the British government was only around £8 million at the time. The numbers were mind-boggling, a crushing weight on the nation's finances. The gentlemen in Parliament, the landowners and aristocrats who ran the country, felt the pressure. Taxes in Britain were already the highest in Europe. The landed gentry were groaning under the strain of the land tax. The common folk felt the pinch in the price of beer and salt. Something had to be done. The coffers were empty, the bills were due, and the government was desperate for new sources of revenue. Someone had to pay for this glorious empire. Across the Atlantic, in the 13 American colonies, news of the victory was met with celebration. Church bells rang out in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Colonists toasted the king and the might of British arms. They were, after all, loyal subjects of the crown. They saw themselves as Englishmen, inheritors of the rights and liberties won over centuries of struggle. They had fought alongside British redcoats against the French and their Native American allies. The threat from the north was gone. The western frontier, once a place of constant fear, now seemed open, a vast continent ripe for expansion. A sense of optimism and security washed over the colonies. They had contributed to the victory. Now they hoped to reap its rewards, to live peacefully and prosperously under the protection of the world's greatest empire. For a fleeting moment, the future seemed bright. But back in London, the men in Parliament had a different perspective. They looked at a map and saw not partners in victory, but subjects who had benefited immensely from the crown's protection, who had been shielded from the French threat by the blood and treasure of the mother country. The American colonies, who now enjoyed unparalleled security and opportunity because of the Royal Navy and the British Army. The American colonies, and yet, how much had they contributed to the imperial treasury? In the eyes of Parliament, shockingly little. The colonists paid remarkably low taxes compared to their counterparts in Britain. The logic in Westminster was simple, and to them, irrefutable. The war had been fought, in large part, for the defense of the colonies. Therefore, it was only fair, only just, that the colonies should help pay down the massive debt incurred in securing their safety. It was time for the Americans to pull their weight. This decision, born of fiscal necessity and a sense of imperial order, would set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The first sign of this new policy came swiftly. Parliament began to pass a series of acts designed to tighten, control, and raise money. The Sugar Act of 1764, for instance, wasn't just about regulating trade. It was explicitly designed to raise revenue. This was a crucial shift. For generations, the colonists had accepted Parliament's right to regulate trade within the empire, but they had always taxed themselves through their own elected assemblies. This new act was different. It was a tax imposed by a distant legislature where they had no representatives. It was a small change, a subtle one, but it felt wrong. A murmur of unease began to ripple through the colonial port cities. Merchants, smugglers, and lawyers started to question the legality, the very principle of it. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765. This was a lightning bolt. Unlike the Sugar Act, which primarily affected merchants, the Stamp Act touched everyone. It required a tax stamp to be placed on virtually all paper goods, legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, even dice. It was a direct, internal tax, impossible to ignore. For the colonists, this was a line in the sand. The rallying cry, "No, taxation without representation," was born, echoing from the taverns of New York to the assembly halls of Virginia. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about a fundamental right. Who had the authority to take their property? Was it their own local, elected representatives, or a distant, unaccountable parliament 3,000 miles away? Suddenly, the celebrated bond between Britain and its colonies began to fray. The sense of shared identity started to crack. The reaction in the colonies was explosive and surprisingly unified. Protest groups, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, sprang up in nearly every colony. They organized boycotts of British goods, forcing merchants to sign non-importation agreements. In Boston, a mob ransacked the home of the stamp distributor, Andrew Oliver. In other towns, stamp agents were intimidated, ungi, inafigi, and forced to resign. This was more than just polite debate. It was open defiance. The colonial assemblies passed resolutions denouncing the act. A Stamp Act. Congress was convened in New York, a remarkable display of intercolonial cooperation, declaring that only their own legislatures had the right to tax them. The sheer force and coordination of the colonial resistance stunned officials on both sides of the Atlantic. The colonists weren't just grumbling, they were organizing. They were fighting back, faced with this firestorm of protest and, perhaps more importantly, the crippling economic impact of the colonial boycotts on British merchants. Parliament blinked. In 1766, they repealed the Stamp Act. The news was met with jubilation in America. Once again, bells rang and statues of King George III were erected. It seemed as though the crisis had been averted, that reason had prevailed. But on the very same day they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed another, more ominous piece of legislation, the Declaratory Act. It was a short, simple statement, but its implications were profound. It asserted that Parliament had the full power and authority to make laws and statutes to bind the colonies and people of America, in all cases whatsoever. The celebration in the colonies died down. The message from London was clear. We may have backed down on this specific tax, but do not mistake it for a surrender of our authority. We are still in charge. The Empire's shadow, once seen as a comforting shield, was now beginning to feel like a cage. The fundamental question remained unanswered, festering beneath the surface of daily life. What was the true nature of the relationship between Britain and its American colonies? Were they equal partners in a grand imperial project, or were they merely subordinate possessions, there to serve the interests of the mother country? The Declaratory Act ensured that this conflict was far from over. It was a constitutional time bomb, ticking away, waiting for the next spark to ignite it. And that spark would not be long in coming. The dispute had moved beyond simple economics. It was now a profound clash of ideologies, a struggle over the very meaning of liberty and governance within the British Empire. The path to reconciliation was narrowing, while another, more dangerous path was slowly opening up. The shadow was deepening, and what lay ahead was shrouded in uncertainty and the growing threat of conflict. Thanks so much for watching. We're a small team dedicated to bringing these historical stories to life, and your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this chapter and want to see what happens next, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss an episode. See you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. Last time, we talked about the simmering tensions after the French and Indian War. Today, we're diving into Chapter 3, the Stamp Act of 1765, the moment when that simmer started to boil over. So, grab a cup of tea or maybe don't, considering what's coming and let's get into it. Imagine you're a colonist in 1765. Life is hard, but it's yours. You've built a home, a business, a community, all thousands of miles from Great Britain. You feel British? Sure. But you also feel different. You're an American. Then, one day, news arrives from London. Parliament, a government where you have no voice, no representative, has passed a new law. The Stamp Act now. Taxes weren't a new thing. The colonies had been paying import duties, like the Sugar Act, for years. But the Stamp Act was different. It was the first major tax levied directly on the colonists themselves, not on trade goods. This wasn't about regulating commerce. This was about raising money, plain and simple. And what for? To pay off the massive debt from the French and Indian War. A war the colonists felt they'd already paid for with their homes, their resources, and their lives. So, what did this act actually do? It required an official stamp to be placed on almost every piece of paper you could think of. We're talking about legal documents like wills, deeds, and licenses. We're talking about newspapers, pamphlets, and almanacs. It even hit your leisure time playing cards, and dice had to be stamped. Essentially, if it was printed, it needed a stamp, and that stamp cost money. Think about the implications. A lawyer couldn't file a case without a stamped document. A printer couldn't sell a newspaper. A merchant couldn't get a license. Even a couple getting married needed a stamped certificate. It touched every aspect of colonial life, from the tavern to the courthouse. It wasn't a tax on the wealthy elite. It was a tax on everyone. The reaction was immediate and furious. It wasn't just about the money, though that was a burden. It was about the principle. A voice began to rise. A question echoed from the bustling ports of Boston to the rural farms of Virginia. Why should we pay for a war we didn't choose? More importantly, why should we be taxed by a parliament where we have no representation? This was the birth of a powerful slogan that would define the coming revolution. No taxation without representation. To the colonists, this wasn't a radical idea. It was a fundamental right of every Englishman. They believed that their own colonial assemblies, elected by them, were the only bodies that had the right to tax them. Parliament's move felt like a betrayal, an overreach of power that treated them not as equals, but as subjects to be squeezed for cash. The anger wasn't just spoken, it was acted upon. All across the colonies, opposition groups began to form. The most famous of these were the Sons of Liberty. These weren't just politicians in powdered wigs. They were artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers. They organized protests, some of which turned violent. They intimidated the appointed stamp distributors, the officials in charge of selling the stamps. In Boston, a mob famously hung an effigy of the stamp distributor, Andrew Oliver, from a tree that would become known as the Liberty Tree. They later ransacked his home. The message was clear. This tax would not be collected. The intellectual leaders of the colonies also took up the cause. Patrick Henry, in the Virginia House of Burgesses, delivered a fiery speech where he famously declared, "If this be treason, make the most of it." His resolutions argued that Virginians could only be taxed by their own representatives. In Massachusetts, James Otis argued passionately against the act. Building on his earlier fights against British overreach, the colonies, which had often been disunited and bickering amongst themselves, found a common enemy. In October 1765, delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies met in New York City for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. This was a huge step. For the first time, a significant number of colonies came together to formally protest an act of parliament. They drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a respectful but firm document sent to the king and parliament, asserting their rights as Englishmen and protesting the tax. The economic pressure was just as intense. Colonists organized boycotts of British goods. Merchants in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston signed non-importation agreements, pledging not to buy anything from Britain until the Stamp Act was repealed. This hit British merchants right where it hurt. They saw their sales to the colonies plummet and began to pressure Parliament to reconsider. The combination of street protests, political resolutions, and economic boycotts created a perfect storm. The colonial governments were practically brought to a standstill because no one would use the stamped paper. The law was simply Baikin London Parliament was stunned by the ferocity of the colonial response. They had expected some grumbling, but not this level of organized, unified defiance. British merchants, feeling the pain of the boycotts, lobbied hard for repeal. The great British statesman William Pitt the Elder, a friend to the colonies, argued in Parliament that Britain had no right to lay an internal tax upon America. Finally, in March of 1766, Parliament bowed to the pressure. They repealed the Stamp Act. The news was met with wild celebrations throughout the colonies. Bells rang, bonfires were lit, and toasts were made to the king. For a moment, it seemed like the crisis was over, that harmony had been restored. But here's the crucial part. On the very same day that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, they passed another, less famous law, the Declaratory Act. This act stated that Parliament's authority in America was the same as in Britain, and that they had the right to pass laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In essence, Parliament was saying, okay, we'll take back this specific tax because it's too much trouble. But don't get any ideas. We are still in charge, and we can tax you whenever and however we want. While the colonists were celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act, they largely overlooked the ominous implications of the Declaratory Act. The Stamp Act crisis was a pivotal turning point. It taught the colonists a valuable lesson, that they could successfully resist British policy through unified action. It created a network of leaders and activists that would be crucial in the years to come. It also hardened the positions on both sides. The colonists became more protective of their rights, while Parliament became more determined to assert its authority. The repeal of the Stamp Act wasn't the end of the story. It was the end of a chapter. It was a temporary truce in a growing conflict of ideas. The fundamental question, who had the ultimate power in America, remained unanswered. The stage was now set for the next confrontation, which, as we'll see in our next episode, would come all too soon. The seeds of revolution, sown by the Stamp Act, had taken root. Thanks so much for watching. The story is really starting to heat up, isn't it? If you're finding this series helpful or interesting, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss Chapter 4. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think was the most important consequence of the Stamp Act? See you all next time. Hello and welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, we explored the simmering tensions after the French and Indian War. Today, we're diving into Chapter 4, the birth of a phrase that would ignite a revolution. Imagined it's the mid-1760s. The air in the American colonies is thick with discontent. Britain, drowning in debt from the war, sees the colonies as a piggy bank, just waiting to be cracked open. First comes the Sugar Act, then the Stamp Act, each one a financial squeeze that feels more like a stranglehold to the colonists. They weren't just upset about the money. It was the principle of the thing. They were being taxed by a parliament thousands of miles away, where they had no voice, no vote, no say in their own financial destiny. It felt fundamentally unfair, a violation of their rights as Englishmen. But feelings, no matter how strong, need a voice. They need a banner to rally under, a slogan that can capture a complex idea in a few powerful words. And that's where our story takes a pivotal turn, with a brilliant, fiery lawyer named James Otis Jr. around 1765. Otis, along with other sharp, legal, and political minds of the era, began to crystallize this widespread frustration into a single, elegant phrase. He argued passionately in courtrooms and in print that the power to tax, without consent, was the very definition of tyranny. He wasn't alone. Thinkers like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry were echoing similar sentiments, but it was Otis who helped popularize the perfect encapsulation of their grievance. No taxation without representation. It was brilliant. It was simple. It was undeniably true to anyone who believed in the principles of English liberty. The phrase was like a spark landing on dry tinder. Suddenly, this complex constitutional argument was accessible to everyone, from the dockworker in Boston to the farmer in Virginia. It was easy to remember, powerful to chant, and impossible to refute on its own terms. The phrase didn't just stay in stuffy legal documents or political pamphlets. It exploded into the public consciousness. Think about how ideas go viral today on social media. This was the 18th century equivalent. Newspapers, which were booming in the colonies, eagerly printed the phrase. It became a headline, a rallying cry, a constant reminder of the injustice they faced. Every new edition that landed in a town square or was passed from hand to hand carried this message of defiance. But it wasn't just the press. The phrase came alive in the social hubs of colonial life. The taverns, picture it. Men gathered around a flickering candlelight, mugs of ale in hand, discussing the news of the day. One person says it, "No taxation without representation," and heads nod in agreement. Conversations turned from local gossip to the rights of man. These taverns became incubators of rebellion, places where the slogan was debated, repeated, and absorbed into the common language. It wasn't just a political statement anymore. It was a personal conviction. From the taverns, it spilled out into the streets and into the town meetings. Across New England and beyond, citizens gathered to formally protest the new taxes. And what was the central argument they presented in their petitions and resolutions? You guessed it. The phrase provided the legal and moral backbone for their official acts of defiance. It transformed scattered grumbling into a unified political movement. When a crowd gathered to protest a stamp agent, this was their chant. When a politician gave a rousing speech, this was his crescendo. The power of no taxation without representation was its versatility. For the intellectual, it was a profound constitutional principle rooted in the Magna Carta and the writings of John Locke. For the merchant, it was a clear-cut protest against policies that were hurting his bottom line. For the common farmer or artisan, it was a simple, gut-level declaration of fairness. You don't get to take my money if I don't have a say in it. Period. This phrase did more than just define the conflict with Britain. It began to define what it meant to be an American. It forged a common identity among 13 disparate colonies that, until then, often saw each other as rivals. A New Yorker and a South Carolinian might have had little in common, but they could both agree that taxation without representation was wrong. It was the first great unifier, the ideological glue that started to bind them together into something new. Something that wasn't just a collection of British colonies, but a people with a shared cause. And that's the true genius of it. It wasn't just a complaint, it was a demand. It wasn't just negative, it contained the seeds of a positive solution. Either give us representation in Parliament, or you have no right to tax us at all. The British, of course, would argue for virtual representation, the idea that Parliament represented all subjects of the Crown, whether they could vote or not. But for the colonists, who were used to a tradition of direct representation in their own local assemblies, this argument was hollow. It was a flimsy excuse for an abuse of power. So, as we move forward, remember this moment. The mid-1760s was when the intellectual ammunition for the revolution was forged. The phrase "no taxation without representation" wasn't just a slogan. It was the key that unlocked the colonial mind, allowing people to see their struggle in a new, clearer light. It transformed a tax dispute into a fight for liberty itself. Join us next time as we explore how Britain responds to this growing, unified defiance. The Stamp Act Congress and the escalating protests will set the stage for the first real taste of violent confrontation. The road to revolution is getting shorter. Thanks so much for watching. If you're enjoying this historical journey, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. In our last chapter, we saw tensions rise with the Stamp Act. Now, we dive into Chapter 5. The Sons of Liberty emerge. As the Crown's grip tightened, a new kind of resistance began to stir in the cobblestone streets of Boston, a secret society that would fan the embers of discontent into a roaring flame of revolution. In the summer of 1765, a group of artisans, shopkeepers, and tradesmen, fed up with what they saw as British tyranny, began to meet. They called themselves the Loyal Nine. But as their numbers and influence grew, they would become known by a name that would echo through history: the Sons of Liberty. At their heart was a man whose name would become synonymous with revolutionary fire, Samuel Adams. He wasn't a frontline brawler, but a master propagandist and organizer, a puppeteer pulling the strings of public opinion from behind the scenes. Alongside him were figures like John Hancock, the wealthy merchant, and Paul Revere, the silversmith. This wasn't just a rabble. It was an organized, cross-class alliance, united by a single, powerful idea: liberty. Their meeting places were the stuff of legend. Imagine Boston under a sliver of moonlight. The air is thick with salt from the harbor and the scent of wood smoke. In the hushed back rooms of taverns like the Green Dragon, or beneath the sprawling branches of a massive elm tree soon to be christened, the Liberty Tree plans were made. Whispers turned into strategies. These weren't public forums. They were clandestine gatherings where men risked everything. Secrecy was their shield. They used codes, handshakes, and passwords. To be discovered meant facing charges of treason, a crime punishable by death. Every shadow could hide a spy. Every friendly face a potential informant. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The Sons of Liberty knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. They needed to make a statement, a visual, visceral rejection of British authority that no one could ignore. Their first major target was the Stamp Act. They didn't just write pamphlets against it. They took their outrage to the streets. On August 14, 1765, the city of Boston awoke to a shocking sight. Hanging from the Liberty Tree was an effigy, a crude dummy, representing Andrew Oliver, the man appointed to be the stamp distributor for Massachusetts. It was a powerful act of political theater, a mock execution that sent a chilling message to anyone who dared to enforce the tax. As dusk fell, the protest escalated. A crowd, organized and incited by the Sons of Liberty, paraded the effigy through the streets. They marched to a newly constructed building on the docks, owned by Oliver, which they believed was intended to be the new stamp office. In a frenzy of revolutionary fervor, they tore it down, board by board. The crowd then moved to Oliver's home, where they shattered his windows, broke down his doors, and held a massive bonfire on a nearby hill, burning the effigy in a spectacular blaze. The message was clear and brutal. Terrified, Andrew Oliver publicly resigned his post the very next day. This wasn't an isolated incident. The Boston protests acted like a spark in a powder keg. Similar demonstrations, often orchestrated by newly formed chapters of the Sons of Liberty, erupted in other colonies. In Newport, Rhode Island, effigies of stamp masters were hung and burned. In New York, protesters clashed with British soldiers. A common tactic was the tarring and feathering of tax collectors or loyalist sympathizers, a painful and humiliating public punishment designed to intimidate and enforce compliance with the boycott. They also targeted the physical symbols of the act, the stamped paper itself. Whenever shipments of the hated paper arrived, the Sons of Liberty would lead mobs to the docks, seizing the cargo and burning it in triumphant bonfires. These weren't just riots. They were calculated acts of defiance, designed to make the Stamp Act completely But the Sons of Liberty were more than just a mob. Samuel Adams and his colleagues were brilliant at channeling popular anger into a coherent political movement. They established committees of correspondence, a network of communication that linked patriot leaders across the 13 colonies. A rider could carry news of a protest in Boston to New York, and from there to Philadelphia and on to Charleston. This network was the nervous system of the revolution, ensuring that the colonies, for the first time, were acting in concert. They organized boycotts of British goods, a form of economic warfare that hit British merchants where it hurt the most their wallets. Women, who were crucial to this effort, formed their own groups, the Daughters of Liberty, weaving homespun cloth to replace boycotted British textiles. Through their actions, the Sons of Liberty fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict. They demonstrated that colonial resistance was not just a matter of polite debate in colonial assemblies. It was a popular, grassroots movement with teeth. They showed that ordinary people, when organized and motivated, could successfully challenge the power of the British Empire. They forced the British government into a corner. To back down would be to show weakness. To crack down would risk an even greater rebellion. In 1766, facing economic pressure from British merchants and the reality that the Stamp Act was impossible to enforce, Parliament voted to repeal it. The colonies erupted in celebration. It seemed like a total victory. But in the very same breath, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, a law that asserted their absolute authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The celebration was short-lived. The fundamental issue, who had the right to govern America, was far from resolved. The Sons of Liberty had won the battle over the Stamp Act, but they knew the war for liberty was just beginning. They had tasted victory and learned the power of united, popular action. They would not forget that lesson. The network they had built, the tactics they had perfected, and the spirit they had ignited would all be called upon again. The stage was set for the next confrontation. Thank you so much for watching. The Sons of Liberty showed that change often starts in the shadows, with determined individuals who refuse to accept the status quo. What do you think? Was their most effective tactic? Let me know in the comments below. If you're enjoying this historical journey, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss Chapter 6. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. Today, we're diving into a pivotal moment, a time when scattered colonies began to realize they were stronger together. We're talking about Chapter 6, Colonial Unity and the Stamp Act Congress. Picture this. It's 1765. The air across the 13 colonies is thick with discontent. Just a year prior, the Sugar Act had stirred up trouble, and now Parliament has passed the Stamp Act. This wasn't just another tax on trade. This was a direct tax, a first of its kind, on almost every piece of paper the colonists used. Newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, almanacs, you name it, it needed a stamp. And that stamp cost money. For many colonists, this felt like a gross overreach, a violation of a fundamental principle. The cry of no taxation without representation wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was the core of the issue. Colonists argued that they had no representatives sitting in the British Parliament in London. Therefore, Parliament had no right to levy direct taxes on them. This was a right reserved for their own colonial legislatures, the bodies they themselves had elected. The Stamp Act bypassed these local assemblies, striking at the heart of their perceived rights as Englishmen. The reaction was immediate and widespread. It wasn't just a few radical voices in Boston or Philadelphia. This time, the anger was palpable from New Hampshire to Georgia. Merchants worried about the economic impact. Lawyers saw it as an assault on the legal system. Printers and journalists, who used paper constantly, were directly hit and became some of the loudest voices of opposition. Groups like the Sons of Liberty began to form, organizing protests, some of which turned violent. They intimidated stamp distributors, forcing many to resign before they even started their jobs. Effigies of tax collectors were burned in town squares. It was a grassroots movement, fueled by a shared sense of injustice. But protests and riots, while powerful, were disorganized. A more coordinated response was needed. This is where a man named James Otis from Massachusetts stepped up. He proposed a radical idea: an intercolonial meeting to discuss a unified response to the Stamp Act. Think about how revolutionary this was at the time. The colonies were often rivals, squabbling over land, trade, and resources. They saw themselves as distinct entities, more connected to London than to each other. The idea of them all coming together to act as one was almost unprecedented. Despite the logistical challenges and the deep-seated rivalries, the idea caught on. In October 1765, a historic gathering took place in New York City. We know it as the Stamp Act Congress. It wasn't a full house. Delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies managed to attend. Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, and New Hampshire couldn't send official delegations for various reasons, often due to their royal governors blocking the move. But the fact that 9 colonies sent representatives was a monumental achievement in itself. These weren't just hot-headed radicals. The delegates were some of the most respected and influential men in their respective colonies: lawyers, merchants, and landowners. They gathered not to declare independence, but to articulate their rights as loyal British subjects. They believed they were defending the British Constitution, not trying to break away from the empire. For over 2 weeks, they debated and drafted a response. Imagine the scene. Men from different backgrounds and colonies, many of whom had never met, sitting in a room, trying to find common ground. The result of their deliberations was a powerful and carefully worded document, the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This declaration was a masterclass in political argument. It began by affirming the colonies' loyalty to the crown, but then it laid out their case with crystal clarity. It asserted that colonists possessed all the inherent rights and liberties of natural-born subjects within the Kingdom of Great Britain. Crucially, it stated that the right to be taxed only by one's own representatives was an essential freedom. Since they had no representation in Parliament, any tax imposed by that body was, inter view, unconstitutional. The declaration also argued against the use of the Vice-Admiralty courts, which operated without juries and were being used to try colonists who violated the Stamp Act. This, they claimed, was a violation of the fundamental right to a trial by a jury of one's peers. The Stamp Act Congress sent copies of this declaration to King George III and to both houses of Parliament. They weren't just shouting into the wind. They were using the proper channels of British government to make a formal, unified appeal for redress. This was the colonies, for the first time, speaking with a collective, official voice. At the same time, the economic pressure was mounting. In addition to the official protests from the Congress, colonial merchants organized a widespread boycott of British goods. This was a powerful weapon. They signed non-importation agreements, pledging not to buy anything from Britain until the Stamp Act was repealed. This boycott hit British merchants and manufacturers right where it hurt their wallets. Suddenly, businessmen in London, Liverpool, and Bristol were seeing their profits plummet. They began to pressure their own members of Parliament, arguing that the Stamp Act was a disaster for business. The combination of political pressure from the Stamp Act Congress, popular unrest in the colonies, and economic pressure from the boycotts created a perfect storm. By 1766, Parliament had a serious problem on its hands. The Act was unenforceable, and it was crippling trade. Voices in Parliament, like William Pitt and Edmund Burke, argued for repeal, sympathizing with the colonists' position. In March 1766, after a heated debate, Parliament voted to repeal the Stamp Act. News of the repeal was met with widespread celebrations across the colonies. Bells rang, statues of the king were erected, and toasts were made to the crown. It seemed like the crisis was over, and the relationship between Britain and the colonies had been restored. But there was a catch, a big one. On the very same day that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, it passed another act, the Declaratory Act. This act was short, but its message was loud and clear. It stated that Parliament had the full right and authority to make laws and statutes to bind the colonies and people of America. In all cases whatsoever. Essentially, while they were backing down on the Stamp Act for practical reasons, they were simultaneously doubling down on their claim of absolute authority over the colonies. In the joy of the repeal, many colonists overlooked the ominous implications of the Declaratory Act, but its shadow would loom large over the events to come. So, what is the ultimate significance of the Stamp Act Congress? It was a critical turning point. It showed the colonies that they could overcome their differences and work together for a common cause. It created a network of leaders who would become central figures in the coming revolution. Men like John Dickinson, Caesar Rodney, and John Rutledge met and established relationships that would be vital in the Continental Congress a decade later. The Congress created a template for intercolonial cooperation that would be used again and again. The crisis surrounding the Stamp Act taught the colonies a valuable lesson in political strategy. They learned that a combination of formal petitions, popular protest, and economic boycotts could be incredibly effective. The Stamp Act Congress was the moment the colonies began to form a shared political identity. They started to see themselves not just as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans, united by a common set of principles and grievances. While the road to independence was still a decade away, the first major steps on that path were taken right here, in the meeting rooms of New York City in 1765. The colonies had found their voice. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story is just getting started, and the lessons learned during the Stamp Act crisis will echo through everything that follows. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. Last time, we saw the colonists unite in fierce opposition to the Stamp Act. Today, we're diving into Chapter 7, the British backlash and the repeal, where the economic consequences of colonial anger start hitting Britain where it hurts the most. Imagine this. You're a merchant in London, Bristol, or Liverpool in late 1765. For years, your business has thrived on trade with the American colonies. You ship textiles, tools, and tea, and in return, you get raw materials, and more importantly, money. But now, suddenly, the orders have stopped. Completely. Your warehouses are overflowing with goods you can't sell. Your ships are sitting idle in the harbors, and your debtors in the colonies are refusing to pay what they owe. Why? Because of a little piece of paper called the Stamp Act. The colonial boycotts were surprisingly effective. This wasn't just a few disgruntled individuals. It was a coordinated, widespread economic protest. The Sons of Liberty and other groups organized non-importation agreements, where colonial merchants pledged not to import British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. It was a massive, continent-wide movement. American shoppers, from the wealthy elite to the common farmer, chose to wear homespun clothes instead of British fabrics and to do without imported luxuries. This was more than just a political statement. It was an act of economic warfare. The pressure mounted quickly. British merchants, facing financial ruin, started flooding Parliament with petitions. They weren't necessarily arguing for colonial rights. They were arguing for their own survival. They described the catastrophic drop in trade, the rising unemployment among British workers in manufacturing towns, and the very real threat of bankruptcy. Their message was simple and powerful. The Stamp Act is destroying our economy. Repeal it, or we all go under. Prominent figures in Britain also began to speak out. One of the most influential was William Pitt the Elder, a revered statesman and former Prime Minister. In a powerful speech to Parliament, he declared, "I rejoice that America has resisted." He argued that Parliament had no right to levy an internal tax on the colonies without their representation. His voice added immense political weight to the merchants' economic pleas. Even Benjamin Franklin, who was in London at the time as a colonial agent, was called to testify before the House of Commons. In a masterful performance, he calmly and persuasively explained the colonial position. When asked if the colonists would pay a modified tax, Franklin famously replied that they would never submit to it. He painted a picture of a loyal people pushed to their limits by an unjust law, making it clear that the only way to restore peace and commerce was to repeal the act entirely. Faced with this perfect storm of economic pressure from merchants, political pressure from respected leaders like Pitt, and the undeniable logic presented by Franklin, Parliament was cornered. The new Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham, had been looking for a way out of the crisis since taking office. He saw that enforcing the Stamp Act would require a massive and costly military intervention, which Britain could ill afford, and which might not even succeed. The path of least resistance was clear. So, in March of 1766, after months of heated debate, Parliament voted to repeal the Stamp Act. When the news reached the American colonies, it was met with wild celebration. Bells rang, cannons fired, and toasts were made to the King and Parliament. Statues were erected in honor of King George III. For a moment, it seemed like the crisis was over. The bond between Britain and its colonies, which had been stretched to the breaking point, appeared to have been mended. Butand. This is a crucial, but the story doesn't end there. On the very same day that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, it passed another, less noticed piece of legislation, the Declaratory Act. This act was a face-saving measure for Parliament. It was short, but its message was monumental. It stated that Parliament had the full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America, in all cases whatsoever. In other words, while they were repealing one specific tax, they were simultaneously asserting their absolute, unqualified right to tax and legislate for the colonies. However, and whenever they saw fit, the colonists were so overjoyed by the repeal of the Stamp Act that most of them initially overlooked the ominous implications of the Declaratory Act. They had won the battle, so they didn't pay much attention to the fact that Britain was doubling down on the principle that had started the war of words in the first place. This temporary joy was like to come before another storm. The fundamental question at the heart of the conflict, who had the ultimate authority in the colonies, remained unresolved. Britain believed it was Parliament. The colonists, having successfully resisted once, were more convinced than ever that it was their own local assemblies. The repeal of the Stamp Act taught both sides a powerful lesson. The colonists learned that united resistance, particularly economic boycotts, could force Parliament to back down. The British government, on the other hand, learned that they needed a different approach. They were embarrassed by the retreat and were determined to reassert their authority. The stage was set for the next round of conflict, which would come sooner than anyone expected. The Declaratory Act wasn't just a statement. It was a loaded gun left on the table, waiting for the next disagreement, and that disagreement was just around the corner. So, while 1766 brought a brief and celebratory peace, the underlying tensions were deeper than ever. The seeds of revolution, watered by the Stamp Act crisis, had taken firm root. The core issue of sovereignty was unresolved, and both sides had drawn their lines in the sand. Join us next time as we explore the Townshend Acts and how Britain's next attempt to raise revenue from the colonies would push them even closer to the brink of war. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, please hit that like button and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter in our journey through the American Revolution. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're journeying back to a pivotal moment in American history, exploring a chapter that's often left in the shadows. We're talking about the brave and determined women who joined the resistance against British rule. While names like Washington and Adams echo through our history books, countless women were waging their own war for independence, not on the battlefield, but in their homes, markets, and communities. Their story is one of quiet strength, incredible resourcefulness, and a profound love for liberty. So, grab a cup of tea perhaps, not an English one, and let's uncover the story of the Daughters of Liberty. Picture the scene, the 1760s and 70s. Tensions with Great Britain are escalating. Acts like the Townshend Acts impose heavy taxes on imported goods, including paper, glass, paint, and, most famously, tea. The colonists are furious. They feel their rights as British subjects are being trampled upon. The rallying cry becomes no taxation without representation. But how do you fight an empire without firing a shot? The answer lay in a powerful economic weapon: the boycott. Colonists decided to hit Great Britain where it hurt the most, in its wallet. They refused to buy British goods. This is where the women of the colonies stepped onto the main stage of the revolution. One of the most significant boycotts was against British textiles. In those days, most clothing and household fabrics were imported from England. To participate in the boycott meant giving up fashionable dresses, sturdy linens, and everyday cloth. It was a huge sacrifice. But colonial women didn't just passively accept this. They actively created a solution. They formed groups known as the Daughters of Liberty. Their mission was clear: to create American-made goods, to replace the boycotted British ones. The most potent symbol of their resistance was the spinning wheel. All across the colonies, from bustling Boston townhouses to quiet farmsteads in the Carolinas, women gathered for spinning bees. These weren't just social events, they were acts of political defiance. Imagine dozens of women, their wheels humming in unison, transforming raw wool and flax into thread. This thread would then be woven into homespun cloth, a fabric that became a badge of honor, a symbol of American patriotism. Wearing homespun was a powerful statement. A man in a homespun suit, or a woman in a homespun dress, was publicly declaring their allegiance to the American cause. It showed they were willing to sacrifice personal comfort and fashion for the greater good of liberty. These spinning bees were often public affairs, held on town greens or in meeting houses, deliberately designed to be seen. Newspapers celebrated these events, printing the names of the women who participated and praising their diligence and patriotism. They were turning a domestic chore into a powerful political weapon, demonstrating that the fight for freedom was happening in every corner of colonial life. The Daughters of Liberty didn't stop at spinning. Their influence extended into every aspect of the boycott movement. They were the primary consumers for their households, so their decisions at the local market had a massive impact. They refused to buy imported goods, finding creative substitutes for everyday items. When the boycott on tea began after the Tea Act of 1773, women led the charge. They brewed their own Liberty tea from local herbs, like raspberry leaves, mint, and sage. It might not have tasted like fine English breakfast tea, but every sip was a taste of freedom. These women became the enforcers of the non-importation agreements. They would publicly shame merchants who continued to sell British goods and encourage others to shop only at patriotic stores. Their collective action created a powerful social pressure that made the boycotts effective. They circulated petitions, wrote articles for local papers under pseudonyms, and educated their families and neighbors about the political issues at stake. They were transforming their domestic sphere into a political one, proving that the home was also a battlefield in the war for independence. The courage of these women was celebrated in poems, songs, and newspaper articles of the time. They were hailed as heroines, praised for their virtue, frugality, and unwavering commitment to the cause. While men debated in assembly halls, women were putting those political ideals into practice every single day. Their work was essential to the success of the resistance movement. By producing their own goods, they not only hurt the British economy, but also fostered a sense of American self-sufficiency and identity. They were laying the economic and cultural foundation for a new nation. Think about the sheer scale of this effort. It wasn't just a few dozen women in Boston. This was a widespread grassroots movement involving thousands of women from all social classes. A wealthy merchantess wife in Philadelphia and a farmeress wife in rural Virginia might have had very different lives, but they were united by the hum of the spinning wheel and a shared desire for liberty. They proved that patriotism wasn't limited to soldiers and statesmen. It was found in the quiet determination of a woman spinning thread late into the night, and the careful choices made at the marketplace, and in the refusal to serve a cup of British tea. Their contributions were not just supportive, they were foundational. The economic pressure created by the boycotts, which were sustained largely by the efforts of women, was a major factor that pushed Great Britain and the colonies further down the path to war. When the conflict finally erupted, these same women would continue to support the war effort in countless ways as nurses, spies, fundraisers, and by managing farms and businesses while the men were away fighting. So, as we study the American Revolution, let's remember to look beyond the famous battles and political decrees. Let's look into the homes, the markets, and the community gatherings where the Daughters of Liberty were quietly and powerfully shaping the course of history. They spun more than just thread. They spun the very fabric of a new nation. Their legacy is a testament to the fact that revolutions are won not just with muskets and cannons, but with courage, conviction, and the unwavering spirit of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. I hope this gave you a new appreciation for the incredible role women played in America's fight for independence. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more hidden stories from history, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the American Revolution. Last time, we talked about the repeal of the Stamp Act, and it seemed like maybe, just maybe, things were starting to cool down between Britain and the colonies. It was like a collective sigh of relief was heard from Boston to Charleston. But as we'll see today, that peace was incredibly fragile and didn't last long. The political chess match was far from over, and Britain was about to make another move that would reignite the flames of colonial fury. So, let's set the stage. The year is 1767, back in London. The British government is still facing a mountain of debt from the 7 Years' War. They had repealed the Stamp Act, yes, but mostly because of the economic pressure from British merchants who were losing money. The fundamental problem hadn't gone away. Britain needed money, and they still believed the American colonies should help pay for their own administration and defense. Enter Charles Townshend, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain. Townshend was a sharp, ambitious, and somewhat arrogant politician. He looked at the situation and thought he had a clever solution, a way to tax the colonies that they couldn't possibly object to. He believed the colonists had only rejected internal taxes, like the Stamp Act, which were taxes on goods produced and sold within the colonies. He figured external taxes, duties on goods imported into the colonies, would be perfectly acceptable. Oh, how wrong he was. This led to the passage of what became known as the Townshend Acts. This wasn't just one act, but a series of new laws designed to assert British authority and, of course, raise revenue. The most famous of these was the Revenue Act of 1767. This act placed new taxes on a list of everyday items that the colonies had to import from Britain. We're talking about glass, lead, paint, paper, and most famously, tea. From Townshend's perspective, this was a brilliant move. These weren't direct taxes on individuals. They were duties collected at the ports. He thought he had found the perfect loophole in the colonists' arguments. The revenue raised wasn't just for paying off war debt either. A significant portion was specifically designated to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. Now, this might sound like a boring administrative detail, but it was a political bombshell. Why? Well, up until this point, the colonial assemblies, the colonists' own elected representatives, held the power of the purse. They paid the salaries of the royal governors and judges. This was their leverage. If a governor was acting against the interests of the colony, the assembly could threaten to withhold his salary. It was a crucial check on British power. By having the Crown pay these salaries directly with the new tax money, the Townshend Acts aimed to make these officials independent of the colonial assemblies and solely loyal to the king. The colonists saw this immediately for what it was: a calculated move to strip them of their power and control. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fundamental structure of their government. The reaction in the colonies was swift and furious. People felt betrayed. They had just celebrated the repeal of the Stamp Act, thinking their voices had been heard. Now, here was Parliament, less than 2 years later, trying a different trick to achieve the same goal: taxing them without their consent. The colonists didn't buy Charles Townshend's distinction between internal and external taxes. A tax was a tax, and if they hadn't voted for it through their own representatives, it was an infringement of their rights as Englishmen. The colonists argued that this was a slippery slope. If Parliament could tax their tea and glass, what would stop them from taxing their land, their property, everything they owned? And so, that powerful rallying cry, "No taxation without representation," which had echoed through the streets during the Stamp Act crisis, came roaring back, louder and more defiant than ever. It wasn't just a slogan. It was the core of their argument. They believed they were entitled to the same rights as people living in Britain, and a cornerstone of those rights was that you could only be taxed by a government in which you had elected representatives. Since the colonies had no members in the British Parliament, they argued that Parliament had no right to tax them. Then Ayr arrested no Silaga. One of the most influential responses came from a Pennsylvania lawyer named John Dickinson. He wrote a series of essays called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. These letters were published in newspapers across the colonies and were hugely popular. Dickinson eloquently and persuasively argued against the Townshend Acts. He agreed that Parliament had the right to regulate trade, but he stated clearly that using taxes to raise revenue from the colonies without their consent was unconstitutional. His calm, logical arguments unified public opinion and gave a powerful voice to the colonial cause, convincing many who were on the fence that this was a fight worth having. But it wasn't just about writing letters. The colonists decided to hit Britain where it hurt most: their economy. Just as they had done with the Stamp Act, they organized a widespread boycott of British goods. This was a non-importation movement, and it was even more organized and widespread this time. Merchants in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia signed agreements not to import the taxed items. But it went beyond the merchants. ordinary people got involved in a very personal way. This was a grassroots movement. Colonial housewives, who made most of the purchasing decisions for their families, became key players. They refused to buy British fabrics, instead holding spinning bees to make their own homespun cloth. Wearing homespun clothes became a badge of honor, a visible symbol of patriotism and resistance. They found substitutes for other British goods and, most famously, they boycotted British tea, often opting for herbal teas or smuggled Dutch tea. This boycott was a powerful statement. It demonstrated that the colonies could unite and cooperate for a common cause. It put immense economic pressure on British merchants and manufacturers, who once again saw their profits plummet. They began flooding Parliament with petitions, pleading for the repeal of the Townshend Acts, just as they had done with the Stamp Act. The anger wasn't just economic. It was tangible. The new laws also established a new customs board in Boston to enforce the taxes and crack down on smuggling. This meant more British officials on the ground, leading to more friction and more tension. Every interaction became a potential flashpoint. The presence of these customs officials, seen as agents of an unjust system, only fueled the colonists' resentment. Boston, in particular, became a hotbed of protest and agitation, setting the stage for even more dramatic confrontations to come. The Townshend Acts, designed to be a clever and subtle assertion of power, had completely backfired. Instead of quietly raising money and securing colonial officials' loyalty, they had achieved the exact opposite. They had reawakened colonial anger, unified them in economic resistance, and pushed them further down the path of defining what their rights were and what they were willing to do to defend them. The short period of calm was over. The battle lines were being drawn more clearly than ever, and the stage was set for the next, and far more violent, chapter in this escalating conflict. The renewed anger was real. It was deep, and it was spreading. Thanks so much for watching. We're getting closer and closer to the breaking point, and you won't want to miss what happens next. If you're finding this series helpful and want to continue following the journey to independence, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Today, we're diving into Chapter 10, a moment when simmering tensions finally boiled over into bloodshed. The Boston Massacre of 1770. This was a battle fought on a sprawling field. It was a street-level clash that would ignite the colonies and push them further down the path to independence. To truly understand what happened on that cold March night, we need to feel the tension that had been building in Boston for years. Imagine a city under occupation. Red-coated British soldiers, sent to enforce unpopular laws like the Townshend Acts, were a constant, visible reminder of British authority. For the colonists, these soldiers weren't protectors. They were a foreign army in their own streets. The friction was constant and personal. Colonists and soldiers competed for jobs, especially for unskilled labor on the docks. A soldier earning a meager wage could supplement his income by taking work that a local man needed to feed his family. This created a deep-seated economic resentment. Insults and taunts were exchanged daily. Fights in taverns and brawls in the street were common. The air was thick with mistrust. The soldiers saw the colonists as an ungrateful, rebellious mob. The colonists saw the soldiers as instruments of tyranny, a threat to their liberty and their livelihoods. It was a pressure cooker, and on the night of March 5th, 1770, it was about to explode. The night began, as many did, with a minor dispute. A young apprentice taunted a British officer about an unpaid bill. A sentry, Private Hugh White, standing guard outside the custom house on King Street, intervened to defend the officer's honor. Words escalated to shoves. The apprentice's cries of outrage drew a crowd. More colonists began to gather, their anger fueled by years of pent-up frustration. The lone sentry soon found himself surrounded by a growing, hostile crowd. The scene was chaotic. Church bells began to ring, a signal that usually meant a fire, drawing even more people into the streets. The crowd wasn't just yelling insults anymore. They were throwing whatever they could find. Snowballs packed with ice, oyster shells, chunks of wood. They dared the soldier to fire. It was a dangerous mix of mob fury and youthful bravado. Fearing for his life, Private White called for backup. Captain Thomas Preston, the officer of the day, responded, marching a small relief detachment of 7 soldiers from the 29th Regiment of Foot through the angry mob to rescue the beleaguered sentry. They formed a defensive semicircle in front of the custom house, bayonets fixed. This show of force didn't disperse the crowd. It enraged them further. The colonists pressed closer, waving clubs and sticks, screaming, "Fire, you cowards! Fire and be damned." They were practically daring the soldiers to shoot, perhaps not truly believing they would. The situation was teetering on a razor's edge. Captain Preston stood between his men and the crowd, desperately trying to de-escalate, ordering the crowd to disperse and his men to hold their fire. In the midst of the chaos, the shouting, and the confusion, someone yelled fire. To this day, we don't know who. Was it a colonist daring the soldiers? Was it one of the soldiers mishearing an order? Or was it a deliberate command? What we do know is what happened next. A soldier, possibly after being struck by a club, stumbled and discharged his musket. A brief, terrifying pause, and then the other soldiers, perhaps thinking the order had been given, opened fire in a ragged volley directly into the crowd. Panic erupted. The colonists who'd been so defiant just moments before now scrambled for their lives. When the smoke cleared, the scene was one of horror. 3 men lay dead in the snow-covered street. 2 others were mortally wounded and would die within days. 8 more were injured. The tense standoff had turned into a slaughter. Among the first to fall was a man named Crispus Attucks. His story is a powerful symbol of the diverse group of people caught up in the revolutionary struggle. Attucks was a man of mixed African and Native American heritage who had escaped slavery and become a sailor and rope maker. He was at the front of the crowd, a leader in the confrontation against the soldiers. His death made him, in the eyes of many, the first martyr of the American Revolution. The other victims were Samuel Gray, a rope maker; James Caldwell, a sailor; Samuel Maverick, a 17-year-old apprentice who died the next day; and Patrick Carr, an Irish immigrant who died 2 weeks later. These weren't wealthy politicians or philosophers. They were working-class Bostonians. Their deaths brought the abstract arguments about rights and taxes down to the brutal reality of life and death. The blood on the snow of King Street was a visceral, undeniable fact. The immediate aftermath was explosive. Boston was on the verge of an all-out war. Thousands of enraged citizens swarmed the streets, ready to drive the British out by force. Acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson, fussing a full-blown insurrection, had no choice but to order Captain Preston and his soldiers to be arrested and the British regiments to withdraw from the city to Castle Island in the harbor. This was a major concession and a victory for the colonists. But it wasn't enough. They demanded justice. But what did justice look like? For radical patriots like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, this was a golden opportunity. They immediately seized on the event. Branding a T-Boson massacre, the name itself was a stroke of propaganda genius. It wasn't a riot or an unfortunate incident. It was a massacre, painting the colonists as innocent victims of brutal military oppression. Paul Revere, a skilled silversmith and engraver, created the most famous and influential image of the event. His engraving, titled "The Bloody Massacre Perpetrated in King Street," is a masterpiece of political propaganda. It depicts a line of organized, smiling British soldiers firing a coordinated volley into a small, helpless, and well-dressed crowd of colonists. Under the command of a sword-waving Captain Preston, a small dog stands calmly in the foreground, underscoring the supposed peacefulness of the crowd. The custom house is mislabeled Butch's Hall. The image is wildly inaccurate. It ignores the mob's aggression, the thrown projectiles, and the chaotic nature of the event. But accuracy wasn't the point. The point was to evoke emotion, outrage, sympathy, and hatred for the British. Revere's engraving was printed and distributed throughout the colonies, becoming the definitive image of the event in the public mind. It was incredibly effective, turning a complex and messy street fight into a simple, powerful story of tyranny and martyrdom. Now, for one of the most fascinating twists in this story: the trial. The arrested soldiers needed a lawyer, but who in Boston would dare defend the most hated men in the city? In a remarkable turn of events, the task fell to a 34-year-old lawyer and a committed patriot, John Adams. Yes, that John Adams, a future founding father, and the second president of the United States, his cousin, Samuel Adams, was leading the public outcry against the soldiers. But John Adams believed deeply in a core principle, that every person, no matter how unpopular, deserved a fair trial and a proper defense. He knew taking the case would risk his reputation, his law practice, and even his safety. But he believed the law and the right to a defense were more important than public opinion. He argued that if the colonists couldn't give these soldiers a fair trial, then their own arguments about English rights and justice were meaningless. Joined by fellow patriot Josiah Quincy Jr., Adams prepared to defend the soldiers. The trial was a landmark moment for the American legal system. Adams's defense was brilliant. He didn't try to defend the British presence in Boston. Instead, he focused on the facts of that chaotic night. He skillfully cross-examined witnesses, highlighting the confusion, the darkness, and the fear. He painted a picture of soldiers who were surrounded, threatened, and provoked by a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and Irish Teagues, and outlandish Jack Tars. He argued that the soldiers had fired in self-defense, a reasonable response to a life-threatening situation. He urged the jury to look beyond their anger and political loyalties and to judge the case based on evidence and law alone. Facts are stubborn things, he famously declared, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. He was asking the Boston jury to rise above the mob mentality. The jury, composed of colonists, acquitted Captain Preston entirely. Only two, Privates Montgomery and Kilroy, who were proven to have fired directly into the crowd, were convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter. Their punishment was to be branded on the thumb with the letter M for manslaughter and then released. The verdict was a stunning victory for the rule of law over mob justice. It showed that the American colonies, for all their passionate rhetoric, were capable of upholding the very legal principles they accused Britain of violating. While radicals were disappointed, Adams's actions reinforced the moral high ground of the patriot cause. It demonstrated a commitment to justice that would be foundational to the new nation they were beginning to imagine. It served as a powerful rallying cry, a permanent scar on the relationship between Britain and the colonies. For the next several years, colonists would mark the anniversary of March 5th with solemn commemorations, speeches, and public readings, keeping the memory of the martyrs alive. The cry for justice, which John Adams had so brilliantly served in the courtroom, now became inextricably entwined with the larger cry for representation. The event proved to many colonists that the British government was willing to use lethal force to enforce its will. It transformed abstract political disagreements into a matter of life and death, radicalizing many who had previously been on the fence. While a temporary calm followed the massacre, with Parliament even repealing most of the Townshend Acts, the damage was done. The memory of the blood on King Street would linger, a potent symbol of British tyranny that would be invoked again and again, as the colonies moved ever closer to their final revolutionary break with Great Britain. It's a complex story of fear, anger, propaganda, and a surprising triumph of legal principle. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter in the road to revolution. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our series on the American Revolution. Last time, we talked about a period of relative calm after the Boston Massacre. But don't let that fool you. Under the surface, the embers of discontent were still glowing, just waiting for a spark to reignite the flames. And that spark, it came in the form of something surprisingly simple. Today, we'll be diving into Chapter 11, the Tea Act of 1773. This isn't just a story about a tax on a popular beverage. It's a story about principles, power, and how a clever political maneuver backfired spectacularly, pushing the colonies one giant step closer to all-out rebellion. So, let's set the stage. It's the early 1770s. In London, a massive, powerful corporation is in deep financial trouble. We're talking about the British East India Company. This wasn't just any company. It was a global behemoth, a cornerstone of the British Empire. It had its own army, ruled vast territories in India, and was, frankly, too big to fail in the eyes of the British government. But by 1773, the company was teetering on the brink of collapse. Why? A combination of mismanagement, corruption, and a massive surplus of its most important product. Tea. We're talking about millions of pounds of tea, 17 million pounds, to be exact, sitting unsold in its warehouses in London, rotting away. This was a crisis. If the East India Company went bankrupt, it would create a financial tsunami that could cripple the British economy. Parliament, led by Prime Minister Lord North, had to act. They decided to bail out the company. But how? Their solution was the Tea Act of 1773. Now, you might hear Tea Act and immediately think, oh, another tax on the colonies. But here's the twist, and it is a crucial one. The Tea Act did not actually impose any new taxes on the American colonists. I know, that sounds counterintuitive, right? The tax on tea that the colonists had been protesting, the one from the old Townshend Acts, was actually still in place. The Tea Act's main goal was to help the East India Company sell its massive tea surplus directly to the American colonies, bypassing the middlemen merchants in England. Here's how it worked. Before the Tea Act, the company had to ship its tea to Britain first, where it was taxed and then sold at auction to wholesale merchants. These merchants then sold it to American retailers. The Tea Act changed all of that. It allowed the East India Company to ship its tea directly from its warehouses to designated agents in the American colonies. This cut out the British middlemen and drastically reduced the shipping and handling costs. And here is the kicker. The act also refunded the heavy duties the company would have paid in Britain. The only tax that remained was the small, 3p per pound, Townshend duty that had to be paid when the tea was unloaded in America. The result, the company's tea, even with the Townshend tax, would be cheaper than any other tea available in the colonies. It would be cheaper than the tea legally imported by American merchants, and, most importantly, it would be significantly cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that was so popular at the time. From Parliament's perspective in London, this seemed like a genius move. A win-win-win. First, the East India Company gets saved from bankruptcy by selling its tea. Second, the British government gets the revenue from the Townshend tax, subtly reaffirming its right to tax the colonies. And third, the American colonists get their beloved tea at a bargain price. What's not to love? Lord North and his government probably sat back, patted themselves on the back, and thought they had finally outsmarted those stubborn colonists. They couldn't have been more wrong. When news of the Tea Act reached the colonies, it was met not with celebration, but with fury. Why would the colonists be angry about cheaper tea? Because they understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about the price of tea. It was about the principle. For years, the colonists had been arguing against taxation without representation. They believed that only their own elected colonial assemblies had the right to tax them. By passing the Tea Act, Parliament was trying to trick them into accepting that principle. They were baiting a trap with cheap tea. If the colonists bought the tea, they would be paying the Townshend tax, and in doing so, they would be implicitly acknowledging Parliament's right to tax them. It was a slippery slope, and the colonists saw it a mile away. Patriot leaders like Samuel Adams in Boston were masters at framing the narrative. They immediately went to work, spreading the word that this was not a bailout. It was a Trojan horse. They argued that it was a monopolistic scheme designed to put local American tea merchants out of business, and they had a point. The Tea Act gave the East India Company a monopoly on the American tea trade. A handful of royally appointed agents, or consignees, were chosen to receive and sell the tea. These were often wealthy, loyalist merchants, which only added to the resentment. Local smugglers, who had been doing brisk business with Dutch tea, and legitimate colonial merchants, who couldn't compete with the East India Company's prices, were now facing financial ruin. So, the economic argument resonated just as strongly as the political one. Pamphlets, newspapers, and town meetings exploded with outrage. The cry went up. This wasn't just about a tax. It was about liberty. It was an attack on their rights as Englishmen and their economic freedom. The colonists viewed it as a deliberate attempt to corrupt them with a cheap luxury, to make them trade their fundamental liberties for a lower price on a cup of tea, and they were not going to fall for it. The resistance was swift and organized, all up and down the Atlantic coast, From Charleston to Philadelphia to New York, patriots began to coordinate their efforts. Their plan was simple. Do not let the tea land in many cities. The pressure campaign worked. In Charleston, the tea was unloaded, but intimidated local agents didn't dare sell it, so it was locked away in a damp cellar and left to rot. In Philadelphia and New York, the consignees were persuaded to resign, and the tea ships, facing unified popular opposition, were forced to turn around and sail back to England with their cargoes still on board. But in Boston, things were different. Massachusetts's Royal Governor, Thomas Hutchinson, was determined to enforce the law. To make matters worse, 2 of his own sons were among the chosen tea consignees. Hutchinson refused to allow the tea ships to leave the harbor without first unloading their cargo and paying the duty. He was drawing a line in the sand. By late November 1773, 3 ships loaded with East India Company tea, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaverhead, arrived in Boston Harbor. According to customs law, the cargo had to be unloaded and the duty paid within 20 days, or the ships and their goods would be seized by customs officials. That set a hard deadline. December 16th. The city was a powder keg. Huge public meetings were held at the Old South Meeting House, with thousands of citizens attending. They demanded that the ships be sent back. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty were at the center of it all, organizing the resistance. They negotiated with the ship owners and the consignees, but Governor Hutchinson would not budge. He ordered warships to block the entrance to the harbor, ensuring the tea ships couldn't leave. The stalemate was complete. The colonists wouldn't let the tea be unloaded. The governor wouldn't let the ships leave. The clock was ticking down to December 16th. Everyone knew something had to give. The stage was set for one of the most iconic acts of defiance in American history, an event that would directly lead to punitive measures from Britain and push the 2 sides to the brink of war. And that event, of course, is the Boston Tea Party, which is exactly what we'll be covering in our next chapter. So what the Tea Act of 1773 shows us is that this conflict was never just about money. It was about deep-seated beliefs in rights, representation, and who held the ultimate power to govern. Parliament thought it was offering a practical solution to an economic problem, but the American colonists saw it as a fundamental threat to their freedom. They chose principle over price, and that choice would change the world. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this gives you a clearer picture of why the Tea Act was such a pivotal moment on the road to revolution. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode on the Boston Tea Party. As always, drop your questions and comments below. I love reading them. See you next time. Picture this: a cold, dark night in Boston. The air is thick with tension, salt, and the quiet footsteps of men with a purpose. The date is December 16th, 1773. Tonight, something historic is about to happen, something that will echo through the ages. This isn't just a story about tea, it's a story about the birth of a nation. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we are re-diving into one of the most iconic events leading up to the Revolution, the Boston Tea Party. Now, when you hear that phrase, you probably imagine a group of angry colonists dumping tea into the harbor. And you'd be right, but that's only scratching the surface. The real story is so much deeper, more complex, and frankly, more exciting. To truly understand what happened that night, we need to rewind a bit. The relationship between Great Britain and its American colonies had been strained for years. Think of it like a family argument that just keeps escalating. It started with things like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act's taxes imposed by the British Parliament on the colonists. The problem wasn't just the money. The colonists had no representatives in that parliament. They had no voice in the laws being made for them. Imagine someone else deciding how you spend your hard-earned money without even asking you. You'd be pretty upset, right? This is where the famous phrase, "No taxation without representation," comes from. It became the rallying cry for a generation. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a fundamental belief that government power must come from the consent of the governed. The colonists saw themselves as Englishmen, entitled to the same rights and freedoms as their counterparts across the Atlantic. But time and again, they felt those rights were being ignored. Now, Let's talk about the tea. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act. On the surface, it might not seem so bad. It actually made tea cheaper for the colonists by giving the financially struggling British East India Company a monopoly on the American tea trade. They could sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing the colonial merchants who usually acted as middlemen. So, cheaper tea. What's the problem? Well, it was a trap. A very clever, very political trap. The act still included a small tax on the tea. By buying this cheaper tea, the colonists would be implicitly accepting Parliament's right to tax them. It was a test of principle. Would they choose cheaper goods over their political freedom? The British were betting they would. They were wrong. For the colonists, especially in a bustling port city like Boston, this was the last straw. The arrival of the tea ships the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver was like a ticking time bomb. Patriots like Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty saw this as a moment of truth. They organized meetings. They protested. They tried to get the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, to send the ships back to England without unloading the cargo. Hutchinson refused. He was determined to enforce the law and land the tea. The deadline was set. If the tea wasn't unloaded and the duties paid by December 17th, customs officials would seize the cargo, sell it, and the tax would be collected anyway. The colonists were so we returned to that fateful night, December 16th. Thousands of people gathered at the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in Boston at the time. The atmosphere was electric. Samuel Adams addressed the massive crowd, and when the final word came that the governor would not relent, he reportedly announced, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." Many historians see this as a prearranged signal. As if on cue, war whoops and cries echoed from the doorway. A group of about 150 men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, emerged and headed for Griffin's Wharf, where the tea ships were docked. Why the disguise? It wasn't just for fun. The Mohawk disguise served several purposes. It was a symbol of a distinct American identity, separate from the British. It also helped protect the identities of the participants. This was an act of treason, and the consequences could be severe. By donning this costume, they were both hiding their faces and making a powerful statement. The men worked with surprising efficiency and order. This wasn't a chaotic, drunken riot. It was a well-organized political protest. They boarded the 3 ships, broke open the chests of tea with axes, and methodically dumped every single one into the harbor. Over the course of 3 hours, 342 chests of tea, valued at over $1 million in today's money, were destroyed. The participants were careful not to damage any other part of the ships or steal anything. One man who tried to pocket some tea was reportedly stripped of his coat and kicked out. The point was clear. This was not about theft. This was about principle. As dawn broke over Boston Harbor, the water was stained brown with floating tea leaves. The message sent to London was loud and clear. The colonists would not be bribed. They would not surrender their rights. The reaction from Great Britain was swift and furious. King George III and Parliament were outraged. They saw the Boston Tea Party not as a protest, but as a direct challenge to their authority, an act of rebellion. They decided to make an example of Boston. In 1774, they passed a series of punitive laws, known as the Coercive Acts, as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts. These acts were designed to punish Massachusetts and bring the colony to heel. The port of Boston was closed until the city paid for the destroyed tea. The Massachusetts government was put under direct royal control, and town meetings were severely restricted. British officials accused of crimes would be tried in England, not in the colonies, and a new quartering act required colonists to house British soldiers in their homes if necessary. Instead of isolating Boston, these harsh measures had the opposite effect. The other colonies rallied to Boston's side, sending supplies and messages of support. They saw the Intolerable Acts as a threat to all of them. If Parliament could do this to Massachusetts, they could do it to any colony. This shared outrage led to the calling of the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September 1774. Delegates from 12 of the 30 colonies came together to coordinate a response. They organized a boycott of British goods and began to lay the groundwork for a unified American resistance. The Boston Tea Party, therefore, was a critical turning point. It transformed a long-simmering dispute over taxes and representation into a full-blown crisis. It was a bold act of defiance that escalated the conflict dramatically and pushed both sides further down the path to war. What started as a protest over tea had lit a fuse that would eventually explode into the American Revolution. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most significant historical moments aren't battles or grand declarations, but acts of civil disobedience fueled by a deep-seated belief in freedom. It showed that ordinary people, when pushed too far, have the power to challenge empires and change the course of history. The splash of that tea in Boston Harbor was the sound of a new world beginning. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Boston Tea Party. It is a story that continues to inspire and teaches us so much about the price of liberty. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue exploring the incredible story of America, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, we saw the colonists of Boston throw a rather expensive tea party. Well, the bill has come due, and Britain is not in a forgiving mood. This is the story of the Intolerable Acts of 1774. The moment the hammer fell, and the colonies realized they were all in this together. Imagine this. One morning you wake up, and your city's lifeblood, its bustling port, is completely sealed off. No ships in, no ships out. That's exactly what happened to Boston. The British Parliament, furious over the Boston Tea Party, passed what they called the Coercive Acts. The colonists, however, had a different name for them. The Intolerable Acts. And believe me, they were. The first and most crippling was the Boston Port Act. It was a lockdown, pure and simple. The port would remain closed until the colonists paid for every last chest of tea they had dumped into the harbor. For a city built on maritime trade, this was an economic death sentence. Think about the sailors, the dock workers, the merchants, the artisans. Everyone's livelihood vanished overnight. The message from London was crystal clear. Step out of line, and we will starve you into submission. But Britain didn't stop there. They wanted to dismantle the very spirit of Massachusetts' independence. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act. This law was a direct assault on colonial self-governance. It stripped the colonists of their right to elect their own officials. The Colonial Council, once chosen by the people, was now to be appointed by the Crown. Even town meetings, the bedrock of New England democracy, where local issues were debated and decided, were severely restricted. They could only happen once a year, and only with the governor's permission. It was as if someone came into your house and told you that you were no longer allowed to decide what is for dinner or when to meet as a family. The colonists' ability to govern themselves was being systematically erased. Then came the Administration of Justice Act, which the colonists grimly nicknamed the Murder Act. This law stated that any British official accused of a capital crime while enforcing British laws in the colonies could be sent back to Britain for trial. The colonists were outraged. They saw this as a free pass for officials to commit crimes against them with impunity. How could they ever get a fair trial if the accused was tried 3,000 miles away by a jury of their countrymen? It felt like a blatant message that British lives were worth more than colonial lives. To add insult to injury, a new Quartering Act was passed. This wasn't the first one, but it was tougher. It allowed British governors to house soldiers in private homes, barns, and other buildings if suitable quarters weren't provided. Imagine having to open your home to the very soldiers sent to enforce these oppressive laws against you. It was a constant, invasive reminder of British military occupation and colonial powerlessness. Finally, though not officially one of the coercive acts, the Quebec Act was passed around the same time and was seen by the colonists as part of the same tyrannical package. This act expanded the territory of Quebec-Salve into lands the colonists believed were theirs, and it granted religious freedom to Catholics in the region. For the largely Protestant colonists, who already had a deep-seated distrust of Catholicism, this felt like a strategic move by Britain to hem them in and create a hostile northern border. So, let's recap the punishment. Boston's port was blockaded. Massachusetts's government was gutted. British officials were given legal cover, and soldiers could be quartered in their homes. It was a systematic, calculated punishment designed to break the spirit of Massachusetts and make an example of them. But Parliament made a monumental miscalculation. They thought that by isolating and crushing Massachusetts, they would terrify the other colonies into obedience. They expected the other 12 to breathe a sigh of relief and say, "Better them than us." The opposite happened. From Georgia to New Hampshire, the colonists watched in horror. They saw Boston's suffering not as a localized punishment, but as a preview of what could happen to any of them. The message wasn't just for Massachusetts, it was for all of America. If Parliament could do this to Boston, they could do it to Philadelphia, to Charleston, to New York. The closure of Boston Harbor wasn't just an economic issue. It was an existential threat. The restrictions on town meetings weren't just a political problem. They were an attack on the fundamental rights of all Englishmen. The Intolerable Act acted like a catalyst, transforming simmering colonial grievances into a unified flame of resistance. Instead of dividing the colonies, Britain's heavy-handed retaliation united them like never before. Food, supplies, and money poured into Boston from the other colonies. Virginia's House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting and prayer and solidarity. It was a powerful display of intercolonial support. The colonies realized that the fight was no longer just about taxes. It was about liberty itself. It was about whether they were to be free citizens with rights or subjugated subjects under the thumb of a distant, unaccountable parliament. They understood that if Boston fell, they would all fall, one by one. And so, in response to this intolerable situation, the colonies decided they needed to speak with one voice. They called for a Continental Congress, a meeting of delegates from all the colonies, to coordinate a response to Britain's actions. This meeting, the First Continental Congress, would convene in Philadelphia in September 1774. It was the first real step toward a unified American government and a direct path to revolution. The Intolerable Acts were meant to be the end of the story, the final chapter in colonial defiance. Instead, they were the beginning of the end for British rule in America. They turned rebels in Boston into martyrs for a cause that now belonged to all 13 colonies. Britain had hoped to isolate a problem. Instead, they created a continent of revolutionaries. Thank you so much for watching this chapter of our story. The stage is now set for a showdown. What will happen when the colonies meet as one for the first time? Make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next episode where we dive into the First Continental Congress. As always, I love hearing from you in the comments. We'll see you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the American Revolution. Last time, we talked about the coercive acts, or, as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts. Britain's hammer had come down hard on Massachusetts after the Boston Tea Party, closing the port and stripping away local powers. But instead of crushing the spirit of rebellion, these acts did something remarkable. They united the colonies in a way nothing had before. And that brings us to our next crucial chapter, the First Continental Congress. Imagine the scene. It is September 1774. The air in Philadelphia is thick with tension and anticipation. 56 men, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies only distant Georgia, didn't send anyone our gathering at a place called Carpenter's Hall. These weren't just random guys. They were the heavyweights of their time. You had the fiery cousins from Massachusetts, John and Samuel Adams. From Virginia, the thoughtful and respected Peyton Randolph, who would be elected president of the Congress, along with the stoic George Washington and the eloquent Patrick Henry. From Pennsylvania, the more conservative Joseph Galloway and John Dickinson. These men were not all on the same page. Think of it like a massive group project where everyone has a different idea of the final outcome. Some, like the Adams cousins, were already leaning towards a more radical path, believing that a break with Britain might be inevitable. Others, like Galloway, were staunchly loyal to the crown and desperately wanted to find a way to patch things up. They saw themselves as Englishmen who just wanted their rights respected. The majority was somewhere in the middle, hoping for reconciliation but unwilling to back down on their principles. Their first big debate was over how to even operate. How should they vote? Should the larger, more populous colonies like Virginia have more say than smaller ones like Delaware? Patrick Henry famously declared, "The distinctions between Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. It was a powerful statement, a glimpse into a future national identity. In the end, they decided to keep things simple and fair. Each colony would get one vote. This decision was crucial because it established a sense of equality and partnership among the colonies, big and small. With the rules set, they got down to business. What were they actually going to do? Their main goal was to articulate a unified colonial response to the intolerable acts. They weren't declaring independence, not yet. That idea was still too radical for most. Instead, they wanted to send a clear, powerful message to King George III and Parliament. You have gone too far. To do this, they drafted several important documents. The most significant was the Declaration and Resolves. This document didn't just list complaints. It laid out the philosophical foundation of their resistance. It asserted that the colonists were entitled to the rights of life, liberty, and property, and that they had never given up these rights as English subjects simply by crossing the Atlantic. It declared that colonial legislatures had the exclusive right to legislate for the colonies in all matters of taxation and internal policy, subject only to the king's veto. This was a direct challenge to Parliament's claim of absolute authority, but words on paper weren't enough. They needed action. To put real economic pressure on Britain, the Congress created the Continental Association. This was a formal agreement to boycott British goods. Starting in December 1774, the colonies would stop importing almost everything from Britain, and if Britain didn't change its policies by September of the following year, they would also stop exporting their own goods, like tobacco and rice, to Britain. This was a massive undertaking. To enforce the boycott, they created local committees of safety in towns and counties across the colonies. These committees were the grassroots engine of the revolution. They monitored merchants to make sure they weren't secretly importing British goods, and they publicly shamed those who violated the boycott. In essence, the Continental Congress was creating a shadow government, an intercolonial network that could enforce its decisions without relying on the established royal authorities. This was a revolutionary act in itself. Of course, not everyone was on board. The more conservative delegates, like Joseph Galloway, were horrified. He proposed his own plan of union, which would have created an American legislature that would work alongside Parliament. It was an attempt at compromise, a middle ground, but it was narrowly defeated by just one vote. The tide was turning towards a more unified and firm resistance. While they were firm, they also wanted to show they were acting in good faith. So, they drafted a petition directly to King George III. It was written in a respectful, even pleading tone. They addressed him as their most gracious sovereign and blamed their troubles on his designing and wicked ministers, not on him personally. They hoped the king would see reason and intervene on their behalf. They were still holding out hope that the king, their king, would protect them. After nearly 2 months of intense debate, negotiation, and planning, the First Continental Congress adjourned in late October 1774. They agreed to meet again in May of the following year if their grievances had been addressed. They left Philadelphia having achieved something remarkable. For the first time, 12 colonies had come together, debated their differences, and forged a common path forward. They had created a unified political and economic strategy. They had transformed a series of separate protests into a single, coordinated colonial resistance. They didn't know it at the time, but the clock was ticking. The petition to the king would be ignored. The British government would only double down, and before they could meet again the following May, the first shots would be fired at Lexington and Concord, turning a political conflict into an armed one. The First Continental Congress was the colony's last great attempt at a peaceful resolution. When it failed, the stage was set for war, and, eventually, for the creation of a new nation. It was a pivotal moment where Americans truly began to see themselves as Americans, united in a common cause. Thanks so much for watching. The story is really starting to heat up, isn't it? If you're enjoying this deep dive into American history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. We'd love to have you along for the entire journey. See you next time. Have you ever wondered how a single idea can ignite a revolution? How a few words, whispered at first, can grow into a roar that topples empires? Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, We're diving into Chapter 15. The cry becomes a movement. This is the story of how an idea didn't just spread, it caught fire. Imagine a world without the internet, without social media, without the instant communication we take for granted. How did a message go viral back then? It was through the tireless work of printers, thinkers, and speakers. The printing presses, once churning out mundane notices, were now working overtime. They were producing thousands upon thousands of pamphlets. These weren't just dry political texts. They were passionate, urgent calls to action, designed to be read, shared, and discussed in taverns, marketplaces, and homes. Each pamphlet was a spark. It carried a simple, powerful slogan, a cry for liberty, that resonated deep in the hearts of those who read it. These weren't distributed by a central authority. They were passed from hand to hand, from friend to friend, carried by travelers from one town to the next. A farmer might find one tucked into his saddlebag. A merchant might discover one slipped into a crate of goods. The message was traveling, seeping into every corner of society. A viral sensation of its time, and it wasn't just the written word. Think of the town squares, the churches, the public halls. Orators, their voices ringing with conviction, would stand before growing crowds. They would take that central slogan and weave it into powerful speeches, explaining what it meant, why it mattered, and what was at stake. They translated complex philosophies into relatable emotions, frustration, hope, and a burning desire for a better future. They weren't just speaking to the people, they were speaking for the people, giving voice to feelings that had long been silenced. Even places of worship became centers of this new awakening. Preachers and ministers, figures of moral authority, would stand at their pulpits. They didn't just preach from ancient scriptures. They connected the fight for liberty to divine will, to the struggle between right and wrong. Sermons would echo with the very same words found in the pamphlets and shouted in the squares. This gave the movement a profound moral weight. It wasn't just a political disagreement anymore. It was a righteous cause, blessed and justified. This fusion of the political and the spiritual was incredibly powerful, making the call for freedom feel like a sacred duty. The result of all this, the pamphlets, the speeches, the sermons, was a profound shift in public consciousness. The slogan was no longer the property of intellectuals and politicians. It had been claimed by the people. Listen closely, and you could hear it everywhere. You'd hear it from a blacksmith, hammering out not just horseshoes, but a new future, muttering the words with every strike. You'd hear it from a baker, kneading dough before dawn, the phrase rising in her heart like the bread in her oven. You'd hear it from farmers walking their fields, looking at the land they worked, seeing it not just as soil and crops, but as their own, something worth fighting for. Artisans in their workshops, merchants in their stalls, sailors on the docks, they all adopted the phrase. It became a greeting, a password, a quiet affirmation shared with a knowing glance. It was a thread that connected strangers, binding them together in a shared identity and a common purpose. This is the magic of a true movement. The slogan transcended its origins. It became more than just words on a page or a sound in the air. It became a symbol. When people said it, they weren't just repeating a phrase. They were expressing a whole universe of feeling. It was the distillation of years of frustration, the embodiment of a flicker of hope, the ultimate moral and emotional banner for liberty. It was the one thing that could unite a weaver from the city, a farmer from the countryside, and a scholar from the university. It represented the belief that every individual had inherent worth and deserved to be free. It was the emotional core of the revolution, the heartbeat that pulsed through the veins of a society on the verge of transforming itself. It was the sound of a people waking up, finding their voice, and realizing that they gathered. Their cry was loud enough to shake the very foundations of the world. What started as a slogan had now become an anthem. It was the soul of the movement, a testament to the incredible power of a shared idea. It proved that when people are united by a common belief, they become an unstoppable force. The cry was no longer just a cry. It was a promise of the dawn that was about to break. Thank you so much for joining me on this chapter of our story. It's incredible to think about how ideas can shape our world. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what you think. How have you seen a simple idea change the world around you. Until next time, stay curious. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we're diving into a moment so pivotal, so explosive, that it forever changed the course of a continent. We're talking about Chapter 16, the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. This is the story of how simmering tensions finally boiled over, how political arguments turned into musket fire, and how the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. 4 years, a storm had been gathering over the 13 colonies. From the Stamp Act to the Boston Tea Party, colonists had voiced their discontent with British rule, chanting slogans like "No taxation without representation." But these were words, protests, and political maneuvers. The conflict had remained, for the most part, a war of pamphlets and speeches. That all changed in the spring of 1775. The air in Massachusetts was thick with suspicion. The British, under General Thomas Gage, occupied Boston, and they knew the colonists were stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in the surrounding countryside. Specifically, they had their eyes on the town of Concord. Gage's plan was straightforward. A secret, nighttime march from Boston to Concord to seize the colonial military supplies. On the night of April 18, 1775, around 700 British regulars, or redcoats, began their mission. But secrets are hard to keep in a city on edge. Colonial spies, including the Sons of Liberty, were watching their every move. As soon as the British troops began to muster, the colonial alarm system sprang into action. 2 lanterns were hung in the steeple of Boston's Old North churches signaled that the British were crossing the Charles River by boat. This was the moment Paul Revere and William Doss had been waiting for. They spurred their horses into the darkness, riding hard to warn the countryside. The regulars are coming out. Their famous midnight ride wasn't a solitary dash, but the start of a chain reaction. As dozens of other riders spread the alarm from town to town, the message flew through the night, waking up farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants who were also members of the local militia, known as Minutemen, so named, because they had to be ready to fight at a minute's notice. As dawn broke on April 19th, the British column, led by Major John Pitcairn, marched into the small village of Lexington. On the town green, they were met by a line of about 70 to 80 colonial militiamen, captained by John Parker. Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." It was a tense standoff, 2 opposing forces, representing 2 different worlds, facing each other across a village common. The British vastly outnumbered the colonists. Major Pitcairn ordered the militia to disperse. "Lay down your arms, you villains, you rebels," he shouted. Captain Parker, seeing the impossible odds, gave the order for his men to disperse, but to hold on to their weapons. And then it happened. A single shot rang out. To this day, no one knows for certain who fired it. Was it a nervous redcoat? A defiant colonist? A stray shot from the woods? We will likely never know. But that one shot shattered the morning quiet and broke the tension like a bolt of lightning. Immediately, the British soldiers unleashed a volley of fire into the dispersing militia. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead or dying on the Lexington Green, with several more wounded. The British had suffered only 1 minor casualty. The war had begun not with a formal declaration, but with a sudden, bloody skirmish on a patch of grass. After the brief and tragic encounter at Lexington, the British regulars reformed their lines and continued their march to Concord, about 6 miles away. Their primary mission was still to seize the colonial military stores. But thanks to the midnight riders, the people of Concord had been warned. They had spent the night and early morning hours moving the cannons, gunpowder, and musket balls to hidden locations in nearby woods and farms. When the British arrived, they found the town largely empty of the supplies they sought. They did find and destroy a few items, some cannon carriages, wooden trenchers, and a small amount of flour. To burn the wooden items, they set a fire that began to spread to the town's meeting. Manuel. Hundreds of militiamen from Concord and surrounding towns had been gathering on the hills overlooking the town. From their vantage point, they saw the smoke rising from the center of Concord and feared the British were burning their homes. This was the final straw. One colonial officer, Joseph Usmer, turned to his commander and demanded, "Will you let them burn the town down?" Spurred to action, the colonial militia, now numbering around 400, decided to march down to the North Bridge, which was being held by a contingent of about 100 British soldiers. This was a deliberate, organized advance, not a panicked reaction. They were marching to defend their homes. As the colonists approached the bridge, the British soldiers fired a few warning shots, followed by a full volley. This time, the colonists were ready. Isaac Davis, a captain from the town of Acton, was one of the first to fall. Seeing their comrades hit, a colonial major named John Buttrick yelled the order. "Fire, fellow soldiers. For God's sake, fire." The Minutemen returned fire with a disciplined volley of their own. The British, surprised by the colonists' resolve and taking casualties, broke ranks and made a hasty retreat back to the main British force. This engagement at the North Bridge was profoundly significant. Unlike the confusing skirmish at Lexington, this was a clear battle. The colonists had stood their ground, fired upon the king's troops, and forced them to retreat. It was an act of open, armed rebellion. The day was far from over. The British commanders realized their mission was a failure and that they were now deep in hostile territory, surrounded by a rapidly growing number of angry militias. The order was given to retreat back to Boston, but the 16-mile march back was no simple walk. It turned into a grueling, running battle. Thousands of militiamen, using what we would now call guerrilla tactics, took cover behind stone walls, trees, and buildings along the road. They fired on the marching British column from all sides. Their redcoats, trained for open-field battles in Europe, were unprepared for this kind of fighting. The road from Concord back to Boston became a terrifying gauntlet of constant sniper fire. The disciplined British retreat began to crumble into a desperate flight. The British soldiers were exhausted, demoralized, and running low on ammunition. The colonial militia, their numbers swelling with new arrivals from every town, harried them every step of the way. It was only the arrival of a British relief column of 1,000 men and 2 cannons, led by Lord Percy, that saved the original force from complete annihilation. Percy's cannons were able to keep the militia at a distance, allowing the battered troops to rest before continuing their harrowing retreat. Even so, the attacks continued all the way to the outskirts of Boston. By the time the British regulars finally stumbled back into the safety of the city under the protection of the Royal Navy Escons, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The colonists had sustained fewer than 100. The news of the fighting at Lexington and Concord spread like wildfire throughout the colonies. It electrified the populace. What had been a political debate was now a war. There was no turning back. The blood spilled on April 19, 1775, washed away any lingering hopes for a peaceful reconciliation. Within days, thousands of militia from all over New England were marching towards Boston, surrounding the city and trapping the British Army inside. The siege of Boston had begun, setting the stage for the next major confrontation at Bunker Hill. Years later, the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his Concord hymn, would immortalize the first shot fired by the colonists at the North Bridge. "They shot had round the world." And it truly was. It signaled to the world that a small group of colonies was willing to take up arms against the most powerful empire on earth for the sake of their liberty. The events of Lexington and Concord transformed the phrase "no taxation without representation" from a political slogan into a battle cry. It was the moment the American Revolution ignited, a spark that would grow into a fire of independence and create a new nation. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the first shots of the American Revolution. The story of Lexington and Concord is a powerful reminder of how quickly history can turn and how the actions of ordinary people can change the world. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter in this incredible story. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into a moment so pivotal, it's like a lightning strike that changed everything. We're talking about the year 1776, a time of tension, debate, and uncertainty in the American colonies. The air was thick with whispers of rebellion, but the idea of a complete break from Great Britain the most powerful empire on earth. For many, that was a step too far. A leap into a terrifying unknown. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," had been echoing through the streets for years. Colonists were angry about the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. They felt their rights as Englishmen were being trampled, but most still saw themselves as just that Englishmen. They wanted their rights restored within the British Empire, not to build a new nation from scratch. The thought of severing ties with the crown was radical, even treasonous to some. It was a conversation happening in hushed tones, behind closed doors, among the political elite, the average farmer, artisan, or merchant. They were caught in the middle, frustrated with British policy but deeply loyal to the king and the familiar structures of colonial life. The future was a fog, and nobody had a clear map. Then, in January of 1776, a man named Thomas Paine unleashed a literary bombshell. It wasn't a dense legal argument or a philosophical treatise meant for scholars. It was a 47-page pamphlet titled, simply, Common Sense. And it wasn't written in the lofty language of the elite. Paine wrote for the common person, for the blacksmith in his forge, the shopkeeper behind his counter, the sailor on the docks. He used plain, direct, and fiery language that anyone could understand. It was like he was sitting right there with you, having a passionate conversation over a pint of ale in a tavern. Common sense landed like a meteor. Paine didn't just argue against specific taxes or policies. He attacked the very foundation of British rule. He questioned the whole idea of a monarchy, calling it absurd that a continent should be forever governed by a tiny island thousands of miles away. He famously wrote, "There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island." It was a simple, powerful image that stuck in people's minds. Why should America, vast and full of potential, be tethered to a distant king who knew nothing of their lives, their struggles, their dreams? Paine went even further. He took aim at the king himself, George III. Up until this point, many colonists had directed their anger at Parliament, believing the king was a benevolent father figure who was simply being misled by corrupt ministers. Paine shattered that illusion. He called the king a royal brute, a tyrant who had no concern for the welfare of his American subjects. This was shocking, revolutionary language. It personalized the conflict, transforming it from a political dispute into a moral crusade against a despotic ruler. But Paine didn't just tear down the old system. He offered a breathtaking vision of a new one. He painted a picture of an independent American republic, a nation founded on the principles of liberty, equality, and self-governance. He argued that independence wasn't just a political option. It was a moral imperative, a natural right. He wrote, "The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent." He was telling the colonists that they had an opportunity to create something entirely new, a beacon of freedom for the entire world. École dit, an asylum for mankind. The impact was immediate and explosive. Common sense was read everywhere. It was passed from hand to hand, read aloud in taverns, churches, and public squares. Literacy rates were surprisingly high in the colonies, and for those who couldn't read, Taylor the pamphlet sold over 120,000 copies in its first 3 months, and eventually 500,000. To put that in perspective, the colonial population was only about 2.5 million people. It was, proportionally, the best-selling American title in history. It became the shared text of a revolution. What made it so powerful was that it connected the dots. It took the colonists' existing grievances about taxes and representation and linked them directly to the grand, electrifying idea of independence. Suddenly, no taxation without representation wasn't just a complaint anymore. It was proof that the entire system was broken and that the only solution was to start over. Paine gave people a language and the logic to articulate what they may have been feeling but could quite express. He turned vague discontent into a clear, focused, and righteous cause. Ordinary citizens, people who had previously felt powerless or were loyal to the crown, began to see things differently. A farmer in Massachusetts, who'd only been worried about the price of his crops, now started to think of himself as a citizen of a potential new nation. A seamstress in Philadelphia, who had felt distant from the political debates, now discussed the merits of a republic with her neighbors. The conversation moved out of the halls of Congress and into every corner of colonial society. Imagine the shift in thinking. For generations, your identity was tied to being a subject of the British Crown. It was a source of pride and security. Now, Paine was telling you that this identity was a chain holding you back. He was giving you permission to imagine a different future. A future where you weren't a subject, but a citizen. Where you weren't ruled by a distant king, but governed by representatives of your own choosing. This was a radical, liberating idea. Before common sense, independence was the desire of a radical few. After common sense, it became the dominant topic of conversation. It galvanized public opinion like nothing else had. John Adams himself, who was initially wary of Paine's radical tone, later admitted, without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. That's how crucial it was. It created the popular will for independence, giving political leaders like Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin the public backing they needed to take the final, momentous step. In just a few short months, Paine's pamphlet transformed the political landscape. It turned a colonial rebellion into a revolution for independence. It took the abstract ideals of the Enlightenment and made them accessible and urgent for everyone. It convinced a divided and uncertain populace that they shared a common destiny. A destiny that lay not in reconciliation with Great Britain, but in the creation of a new nation, the United States of America. The story of Common Sense is a powerful reminder that words have the power to change the world. A single, well-arranged, passionately written pamphlet managed to crystallize the hopes and frustrations of millions, pushing them across the threshold of history. It proves that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to simply speak a clear and powerful truth that everyone is waiting to hear. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a truly game-changing moment in history. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what you think about the power of common sense. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. Today, we arrive at a moment that is not just a chapter in a book, but the very birth certificate of a nation. We're talking about Chapter 18, the Declaration of Independence. The year is 1776. The air in Philadelphia is thick with humidity and even thicker with tension. The Second Continental Congress has been debating and wrestling with a question that will define the future of a continent. Should they break away from the most powerful empire on earth? The arguments for and against are fierce. To declare independence is to commit an act of high treason, a gamble where the stakes are, quite literally, life and death. But the momentum for separation has become unstoppable. The pamphlets of Thomas Paine, the passionate speeches in the Virginia House of Burgesses, the skirmishes that have already turned into battles, all have pointed to this single, inevitable conclusion. The colonies can no longer exist under the rule of King George III. They need to formally and publicly state their case to the world. The task of drafting this monumental document falls to a committee of 5, but the primary author is a 33-year-old delegate from Virginia, a man of the Enlightenment, a gifted writer and a reluctant public speaker, Thomas Jefferson. For 17 days, in a rented room on the second floor of a bricklayer's house, Jefferson toils. He doesn't invent new ideas out of thin air. Instead, he channels the spirit of the age. He draws upon the philosophies of John Locke, the writings of Enlightenment thinkers, and the sentiments that have been brewing in the colonies for over a decade. He seeks to create what he calls an expression of the American mind. And what an expression it is. On July 4th, 1776, the final text is approved by Congress. The opening lines are some of the most famous ever written in the English language, asserting that all men are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But for our story, the most crucial line comes slightly later, a direct and powerful echo of the ideas we've been tracing. Jefferson writes that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Let's pause and really absorb that, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is the revolutionary heart of the Declaration. This single phrase turns the entire concept of government on its head. For centuries, the prevailing belief was that power flowed downward, from God to a monarch, and then down to the people. A king's right to rule was divine, absolute, and not to be questioned. But here, Jefferson, speaking for the colonies, declares the opposite. He states that legitimate power flows upward. It originates with the people. A government is not a master, but a servant. Its only valid reason for existing is to protect the rights of the citizens who created it, and if that government fails in its duty, if it becomes destructive to those ends, the people have the right eben to duty to alter or abolish it. This is the ultimate fulfillment of the cry that began years earlier in that Boston courtroom with James Otis. When Otis argued against the writs of assistance, proclaiming that an act against the Constitution is void, he was planting a seed. He was suggesting that there was a higher law than the king's decree, and that the government's power was not limitless. He introduced the radical idea that the people, through their fundamental rights, had a say in their own governance. Now, in 1776, that seed has blossomed into a full-throated declaration. The abstract legal argument has become a concrete political principle. No taxation without representation was the rallying cry that brought the issue to the streets, making the philosophical tangible. It was the everyday expression of this core belief. If we, the governed, have not consented to this tax through our representatives, then the government has no just power to impose it. The Declaration of Independence takes this principle and elevates it to a universal truth. It's no longer just about taxes or search warrants. It's about the very nature of authority and freedom. The phrase consent of the governed becomes the bedrock of a new kind of nation, one founded not on shared ancestry or ancient tradition, but on a shared belief in a set of ideals. By signing that document, the delegates were not just breaking ties with Great Britain. They were making a promise. They were creating a new social contract, one where the government would be accountable to the people. This was the final and greatest meaning of the phrase. It was no longer a lawyer's argument or a protester's chant. It was now the foundational principle of the United States of America, a standard against which the new nation and all future nations could be measured. Of course, the reality was far more complex. The man who wrote that all men are created equal was an enslaver. The rights and consent spoken of did not extend to women, to indigenous peoples, or to the enslaved African Americans, who made up a significant portion of the population. The ideals of the Declaration were aspirational, a destination the nation was setting out for, not a place it had already arrived. The struggle to make the promise of consent of the governed a reality for all Americans would become the central story of the nation's history, a story that continues to this very day. But on that July day in 1776, the words themselves were a revolution. They provided the moral and philosophical justification for the war that was already raging. They gave the soldiers in the Continental Army a cause greater than just resisting taxes. They were fighting for the right to self-determination, for a government of their own making. And they inspired people around the world, becoming a beacon for other nations and people seeking to throw off the yoke of oppression and claim their own right to govern themselves. From the French Revolution to anti-colonial movements in the 20th century, the echo of Jefferson's words can be heard. So, as we close this chapter, let us recognize the Declaration of Independence for what it is, the powerful culmination of a decade of thought, protest, and sacrifice. It is the moment when consent of the governed transforms from a radical idea into the cornerstone of a nation, setting in motion a grand, difficult, and ongoing experiment in self-government. Thank you so much for joining me on this part of our journey. The story is far from over, as the war for these ideals now begins in earnest. If you're finding this series valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. We'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome back to our series, where we unravel the threads of history that connect us to the world we live in today. In our previous chapters, we traced the journey of a powerful idea, a cry for freedom that echoed through the halls of power and the streets of revolution. Now, in our final chapter, we explore the enduring legacy of that cry. How does a slogan, born from a specific moment in time, transcend its origins to become a universal symbol of hope and defiance? The ink had barely dried on the declarations of independence. The statues of old regimes were still being pulled down, but the spirit of the revolution was already crossing borders. It wasn't just about one nation's freedom anymore. It became a blueprint, a source of inspiration for countless others who yearned for the same fundamental rights: liberty, equality, and a say in their own destiny. The idea that sovereignty belongs to the people, not to monarchs or distant empires, was a radical concept that had now been proven possible. It lit a fire in the hearts of dreamers and activists across the globe. Think about the great democratic waves of the 19th and 20th centuries. From the uprisings in Europe to the anti-colonial struggles in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. You can hear the echoes of that original cry. Leaders of these movements studied the tactics, absorbed the philosophies, and adapted the slogans to their own unique contexts. They saw a reflection of their own struggles in the stories of those who had fought before them. The message was clear: if they could do it, so could we. This wasn't just imitation. It was a conversation across generations, a passing of the torch. Let's fast forward to the modern era. Look at the protests that fill our screens today. From sprawling city squares to digital spaces on the internet. Whether it's a demand for fair elections, a push for social justice, or a stand against authoritarianism, the core principles are strikingly familiar. The idea that ordinary citizens can band together to challenge injustice and demand a better future is the very essence of the legacy we rediscussing. The tools have changed, of course. Banners might be replaced by hashtags, pamphlets, by viral videos, but the fundamental human desire for dignity and self-determination remains the same. This timelessness is what makes the legacy so powerful. It's not a dusty relic in a history book. It's a living, breathing principle that continues to evolve. Each new generation that takes up the call for democracy adds its own voice, its own verse, to this epic song of freedom. They face new challenges, from digital surveillance to economic inequality, but they draw strength from the knowledge that they are part of a long and noble tradition. The struggle for a more just and democratic world is a relay race, not a sprint, and the baton was passed down from those early revolutionaries. Consider the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the People Power Revolution in the Philippines, or the Arab Spring uprisings. In each of these momentous events, you see citizens mobilizing with a shared belief in their collective power. They were fueled by the conviction that a government's legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed. This is the direct intellectual and spiritual heir to the cry for liberty that we've been exploring. It demonstrates that the idea is not bound by culture, geography, or time. It is a universal aspiration. But what does this legacy mean for us, right here, right now? It serves as a crucial reminder. It reminds us that the rights and freedoms we often take for granted were not given. They were won. They were secured through immense sacrifice, courage, and a relentless belief in a better world. This legacy challenges us to be active participants in our own societies, not just passive observers. It calls on us to protect democratic institutions, to stand up for the rights of others, and to continue the work of building a more perfect union, wherever we may be. The story of democracy is never truly finished. It's a continuous project that requires our constant vigilance and engagement. The legacy of the cry is the understanding that history is not something that just happens to us. It is something we make every time we vote, every time we speak out against injustice, every time we engage in civil discourse. We are honoring that legacy. We are keeping the spirit of that cry alive for future generations. It's a powerful thought, isn't it? That a single idea, a single cry for freedom, could ripple through centuries, inspiring so many and changing the course of history for millions. It proves that words have power, ideas have consequences, and the collective will of the people, once awakened, is a force that cannot be easily silenced. It is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and its quest for freedom and dignity. And so, as we conclude our journey, we see that the legacy of the cry is not just in the past, it's in the present, and it's shaping our future. It's a call to action for all of us. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible exploration through history. I hope it's been as insightful for you as it has been for me. If you enjoyed this series and want to see more content like this, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world, and allows us to keep telling these important stories. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. And so, we arrive at the final chapter of our story. The long journey, filled with shadows and whispers, with desperate gambles and unwavering conviction, now draws to its close. We have walked alongside giants and ghosts, through crowded city squares and the quiet solitude of a writer's study. We have felt the chill of uncertainty and the warmth of a shared dream. This has been more than a recounting of history. It has been a journey into the very heart of an idea so powerful, it would cleave a continent from an empire and birth a new nation. It's easy to get lost in the grandeur of it all, isn't it? The sweeping battles, the signing of grand declarations, the statues cast in bronze. We often remember the thunder of cannons and the clash of steel. We picture uniformed soldiers marching in formation, their faces grim with determination. History, as it's often told, is a story of noise, of spectacle, of dramatic, earth-shaking events. And while those moments are undeniably part of the tapestry, they are not where the story truly began. The Revolution's first battlefield was not a muddy field in Lexington or a windswept hill in Yorktown. It was quieter, far more intimate. It was the human mind. Before the first shot was ever fired, before the first protester ever raised a sign, there was a thought, a question, a simmering discontent that needed a voice to give it shape. The real revolution, the one that truly mattered, was a revolution of the spirit, a fundamental shift in how people saw themselves and their place in the world. It was a transformation from loyal subjects of a distant crown to sovereign citizens of a land they called their own. This was not a change that could be commanded by a general or decreed by a king. It had to be inspired. It had to be persuaded. It had to be articulated with such clarity and passion that it could travel from one soul to another, lighting a fire in each. And that is where our story truly finds its soul. It's in the quiet scratching of a quill pen late into the night, the flickering candlelight dancing across a page filled with dangerous, beautiful words. Imagine the silence of that room, punctuated only by the soft whisper of ink on paper. In that stillness, a new world was being imagined. A world where rights were not gifts from a monarch, but inherent endowments from a creator. A world where governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. These were not just phrases. They were intellectual bombshells, challenging centuries of established order. Think of the courage it took. Not just the courage to face a firing squad, but the courage to stand alone with your thoughts, to write down ideas that could see you branded a traitor, to risk everything you have, your property, your family, your very life, for a belief. The men and women who did this were not just politicians or soldiers. They were communicators. They were pamphleteers, orators, poets, and correspondents. They understood that the most potent weapon in their arsenal was not a musket, but a well-reasoned argument, a story that could capture the imagination of a people. Their words traveled. They were read aloud in taverns, passed from hand to hand in bustling marketplaces, debated in town halls, and whispered in homes. They crossed colonies, oceans, and social classes. A farmer in Massachusetts could read the same words as a merchant in Virginia, and in that shared experience, a common identity began to form. They were no longer just Virginians or New Yorkers. They were Americans. A single voice, multiplied by thousands, became a chorus, a deafening roar that could no longer be ignored. The voice spoke of liberty, but it also spoke of injustice. It laid bare the hypocrisy of a system that demanded loyalty without offering representation. It gave a name to the frustration that so many felt but could not articulate. It was a voice that said, "You are not alone in this feeling. Your grievances are valid. Your desire for freedom is just." This validation was the spark. It transformed quiet resentment into public outrage, and public outrage into organized resistance. It gave people a language they needed to demand their rights. As we look back, we see the monumental figures, the Jeffersons, the Adamses, the Paynes, but the voice was not solely theirs. It was the collective voice of countless ordinary people who found their courage in those words. The printer who risked his press to publish a radical pamphlet. The tavern keeper who allowed his establishment to become a hub of revolutionary chatter. The woman who taught her children the principles of liberty alongside their letters. Every person who read, who listened, who repeated the arguments, became a part of that voice. And so, as our story concludes, we are left in this quiet space, much like the one where it all began. The echoes of battle have faded. The great debates have been settled. The ink on the parchment has long since dried. We are left with the soft, persistent glow of an idea. The candlelight, which once illuminated a single writer's desk, now casts its light across centuries. It flickers here, with us, a gentle reminder of a profound truth. Freedom began not with muskets but with words. It was born from the audacity to question, the courage to speak, and the unshakable belief that a single voice, armed with reason and truth, could indeed change the world. That is the legacy we carry forward. The story is not over. It simply continues in each of us who dares to speak, to write, and to believe in the power of a just idea. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the echoes of the past. If you've enjoyed this story and wish to explore more, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to bring these vital stories to light. Until next time, may you find the courage to use your own voice for good.